Hey you! Yes, you the one who pulled the blanket up just a little tighter before pressing play. Welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome, and I am genuinely glad you found this corner of the night. Picture this. It is the year 1280. The city of Paris smells like wood smoke, wet stone, and something you probably do not want to think too hard about. Somewhere in a narrow street not much wider than your hallway, a 12-year-old boy is lying on a bundle of straw staring at the ceiling of a stranger's workshop. He cannot sleep. Tomorrow his new life begins. Not school, not a summer job, something far more permanent. He has just been handed over legally officially, with a signed document to a man he barely knows. And for the next 7 years that man owns almost every hour of his day. His name, his family, his hometown, none of that matters anymore. What matters is whether his hands are quick, his eyes are sharp, and his mouth stays shut about the secrets of the trade. That boy is the beginning of everything we're going to talk about tonight. Before we go any further, if you have been here before, you know what this channel is about. If you are new, think of this as your favourite late-night story. The kind that actually teaches you something without making you feel like you're back in a classroom. If this is the kind of thing that makes your evenings a little richer, a little more interesting, I would love for you to hit that subscribe button and maybe leave a like or a comment down below. Tell me where in the world you're watching this from, what time it is, whether you've got tea or something stronger. I always read those and they always make me smile. But only do it if it genuinely feels right. No pressure. Now dim those lights, find a comfortable position, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background. Let the world outside go quiet, and let us begin. Most of us, when we hear the words Middle Ages, picture something particular. Gloomy stone castles, plague, knights clanging around in armour doing very dramatic things, peasants suffering in muddy fields. And yes, all of that existed. History is honest about the hard parts. But here is what the textbooks tend to gloss over. Somewhere between the years 1000 and 1500, something extraordinary was quietly happening across Europe. Not on battlefields, not in the courts of kings. It was happening on the street corners of growing towns, in cramped little workshops, in the hands of people whose names were never written in royal records. Ordinary people, carpenters and blacksmiths and weavers and bakers were building something that had never quite existed before. A ladder. A real, functional ladder that a person born with nothing could actually climb. And at the centre of all of it was the guild. Now the word guild might bring to mind something a little dusty, a stuffy old organisation, men in robes having very serious meetings. But when you actually sit with what the medieval guild was, what it meant for the people inside it, and even for the people outside it, it starts to feel surprisingly modern, and occasionally surprisingly dark. Let us set the stage. By the time our boy in Paris is staring at that workshop ceiling in 1280, European cities have been growing for over 2 centuries. Before around the year 1000, most of Europe was rural, scattered feudal. If you were not born into a noble family with land, your options were essentially farm fight or prey. That was more or less the entire menu, but then something shifted. Trade routes opened up. Towns began to grow along rivers at crossroads near ports. Merchants moved goods across distances that would have been unthinkable a few generations earlier, and as towns grew, they needed things: shoes, barrels, bread, iron tools, glass windows, leather belts, candles, all the ordinary, essential, unglamorous things that make a civilization actually function. And someone had to make all of it. That demand created opportunity. And opportunity in the hands of clever practical people created organisation. By the 11th and 12th centuries, craftsmen across France, England, Germany and Italy were beginning to band together. Not just casually, not just as neighbours, but formally, with rules, with oaths, with the blessing of local authorities and sometimes the church. By the middle of the 13th century, Paris alone had at least 100 distinct guilds. 100. And by the 14th century that number had risen to 350. Butchers had their own guild. So did knife makers, and nail makers, and helmet makers, and harness polishers. The metal workers of Nuremberg were subdivided into dozens of separate trades, each with its own structure, its own standards, its own jealously guarded territory. Sit with that for a moment. 350 professional organizations in a single city. That is not a medieval quirk. That is a sophisticated economy. So what exactly was a guild? Think of it as three things at once, and none of those things is quite what you might expect. First, it was a quality control system. Every guild set strict standards for what its members could produce and sell. Guild inspectors, actual appointed officials, would walk through workshops and markets, checking products, checking weights, checking prices. If a baker's bread was underweight, that was not just a business problem. That was a punishable offence. The guild had teeth. In England, bakers who sold short loaves could be dragged through the streets on a sled with the offending loaf tied around their neck. Yes, really. Medieval consumer protection was a little more theatrical than what we have today, but the principle was the same. The customer deserved to get what they paid for. Second, the guild was a monopoly, and it wore that word completely without shame. If you wanted to legally practice a trade within a city, you had to belong to the relevant guild. No exceptions. A shoemaker who set up shop without guild membership was not just breaking a business rule. He was breaking the law. Guilds held royal charters, letters of permission from kings or city governments that gave them the exclusive right to operate their trade within city limits. Outside competition was simply not permitted. This sounds harsh to modern ears, and in many ways it was. But the argument the guilds made, and they made it convincingly for centuries, was that without these protections, prices would collapse, quality would collapse, and the entire professional class that made city life possible would collapse with them. And third, this is the part that tends to surprise people. The guild was a social safety net. If a master craftsman fell ill and could not work, the guild provided support. If a member died, the guild helped pay for the funeral and looked after the widow. There were guild chapels, guild feasts, guild celebrations tied to saints' days. The guild was not just where you worked. It was in many ways who you were. Now let us talk about how a person actually entered this world, because this is where the story gets human. If you were a boy in medieval Europe, say around 12 or 13 years old, and your family wanted to give you a future in a skilled trade, there was essentially one path. You became an apprentice. Your father or your guardian would approach a master craftsman and negotiate a contract. This was not a handshake deal. It was a legal document witnessed and recorded. The master agreed to house you, feed you, clothe you, and teach you his trade. Your family, in many cases, paid a fee for this privilege. In Germany, this was formalized extensively. You were expected to arrive with, as the records put it, no baggage, which meant unmarried, no children, no outstanding debts. You were a blank slate. The master's property more or less for the duration, and the duration was serious. 7 years was the rough average across most of Europe for most trades. A cook's apprentice might be done in 2. A goldsmith might spend 10 years learning before he could call himself qualified. 7 years. Think about what you were doing 7 years ago. Now imagine spending that entire stretch, your entire adolescence, in many cases in one workshop, under one man's authority with no wages, learning a craft one painstaking day at a time. Here is what most people get wrong about this system. They imagine it as education, as school, as something designed primarily for the benefit of the student. It was not. The master got years of free labour in exchange for training. The length of the apprenticeship was not always set by how long the craft actually took to learn. It was also set by how useful the apprentice was to keep around. Historians have noted this dynamic somewhat dryly. The benefit of free labour was, as one medieval chronicle puts it, a temptation to extend the training for as long as possible. And yet, and this is the part that keeps me genuinely fascinated, the system worked. Not perfectly, not without exploitation, not without real hardship. But it worked in the sense that it produced generation after generation craftsmen of extraordinary skill. Medieval metalwork, medieval stonework, medieval textiles, things made by human hands in cold workshops without electricity or power tools or computer-aided precision still exist today. And they are breathtaking. Let us come back to that boy on his bed of straw. He is in Paris. The year is 1280, and the city around him is one of the largest in Europe, maybe 200,000 people, packed into streets that smell of every trade you can imagine, and a few you cannot. Nearby, Notre Dame Cathedral is still being completed. It has been under construction for over a century, and it will take another 100 years to finish. The workers building it, the stonemasons, the carpenters, the glassmakers, many of them are guild members. Some of them have travelled hundreds of miles to work on it. Our boy does not know any of this yet. What he knows is that his arms are sore from yesterday's travel, that the straw is scratchy, that the master's house smells like iron and ash, that tomorrow he will be handed a broom probably, and told to sweep before anything else happens. He does not know that this moment, this unremarkable, uncomfortable, slightly frightening moment, is the beginning of something that will define his entire life, his status in society, his income, the respect he will be shown on the street, the woman he will eventually be permitted to marry, whether his own children will have opportunities he did not. All of it starts here, on a pile of straw, in the dark. There is something I want you to hold on to as we go forward tonight. We tend to think of the Middle Ages as a time when your fate was fixed. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant. You were born noble, you died noble. And for many people that was true. But the guild world created something genuinely new, the possibility of becoming. Not just surviving, becoming. A boy from a modest family, not noble, not powerful, not connected to anyone of importance, could enter this system, at 12 endure years of hard training, demonstrate real skill, and emerge on the other side as a respected master craftsman, a property owner, an employer, a man whose opinion the city government actually cared about. That was not nothing. In the context of medieval Europe, that was revolutionary. Now here is what I want you to remember about tonight, about this whole journey we are about to take together. We are not going to spend these hours talking about kings and battles and dramatic political upheaval. We're going to talk about the people who made everything. The ones who were up before sunrise, whose hands were calloused and scarred, who knew secrets about their craft that they were sworn not to share. People who lived in two-room houses, ate simple food, and found meaning not in grand gestures, but in the slow, daily, deeply human act of making something well. And honestly, I think those people might have something to teach us. Because right now, at whatever hour you're listening to this, in whatever room you're settled into the chair, you're sitting in the blanket, you pulled up the cup on your side table, someone made those things. Someone put skill and time and a kind of quiet pride into the work of their hands. The guild craftsmen of medieval Europe were the first people to decide formally and stubbornly that that work deserved to be valued, protected, passed down, made meaningful, and we're just getting started. In a moment we're going to step inside one of the most consequential, and honestly, one of the most emotionally complex moments in a young craftsman's life, the day the contract was signed, the day a child became legally and completely an apprentice, what that moment looked like, what it felt like on both sides of the table, what it cost, and what it promised. Because the story of medieval guilds is really at its heart the story of what it means to give everything you have to learning something worth knowing. Stay with me. You know what strikes me every time I dig into this particular corner of history? It is not the grand events, not the wars, not the crowned heads, not the cathedral spires that everyone photographs. It is the paperwork. Because medieval people, and I say this with genuine admiration, were absolutely obsessed with writing things down. Contracts, oaths, guild charters, letters of complaint, records of fines. And it is in that paperwork buried in archives that most people will never visit that the real human story hides. The story of a father signing his son away, of a child walking through a stranger's door and not coming home for 7 years. That story begins with a document. Let us talk about what an apprenticeship contract actually looked like. Because it was nothing like what you might imagine. When a family decided to place a son with a master craftsman, and this decision was rarely made lightly, because the fees involved could represent weeks or months of a family's income, both parties sat down with a notary or a local official, and they worked out the terms, in writing, in front of witnesses, bound by law. What did those terms cover? Almost everything. How long the apprenticeship would last, what the master was required to teach, whether the boy would receive new clothing, and if so, how often, whether he was entitled to shoes, actual shoes written into a legal contract, because shoes were expensive and nothing was taken for granted, whether the family had paid a placement fee up front, or whether the boy was working it off through his labour. In some cities in northern Italy, these contracts were so detailed that they specified whether the master was permitted to send the boy on errands outside the workshop and for how long. And there were conduct clauses. The apprentice was expected to be obedient, honest, and discreet. He was not to gamble, not to frequent taverns without permission, not to damage his master's tools or waste his master's materials, not to share the secrets of the trade with outsiders. That last point is worth pausing on. The secrets of the trade. In an era before patents, before intellectual property law, before any of the modern systems we use to protect ideas and techniques, the guild's knowledge was its power, and that power was protected by oath and by social contract. An apprentice who revealed trade secrets was not just breaking a rule. He was betraying a brotherhood. And medieval brotherhoods had long memories. Now here is something I want you to really picture, because I think it changes how you understand the whole system. Imagine you are a craftsman, a master weaver, let us say in the city of Florence in the year 1300. You have your workshop, you have your loom, you have years of hard-won knowledge about dye formulas and thread tensions, and the particular way you finish the edge of cloth so it holds its shape through washing. That knowledge is your livelihood. It is also in a very real sense the livelihood of your children and their children after them. Now a 12-year-old boy shows up at your door. He is going to live in your house. He is going to eat at your table. He is going to watch your every move every day for years. He is going to learn everything you know. And eventually when he leaves, he is going to take all of that knowledge with him and potentially use it to compete with you. Why would you ever agree to that? The answer, of course, is that you need him. You need his labour. You need someone to sweep the workshop, to fetch water, to card the wool before it goes on the loom, to hold things steady, while you work to do the 10,000 small tasks that skilled work generates, but does not always require skill to perform. An apprentice was bluntly a workforce you were training to eventually replace itself. And the guild system was the framework that made that exchange feel safe, because everyone played by the same rules and everyone knew what those rules were. There is something quietly elegant about that arrangement, even if the power dynamics were wildly imbalanced. And they were. Let us not romanticize this. The living conditions of an apprentice varied enormously, depending on the trade, the city, and most critically, the character of the master himself. Some masters were fair, even genuinely paternal. They took their legal and moral responsibility to the apprentice seriously. They taught carefully fed, adequately treated the boy as something between a servant and a son. There are records, affectionate ones, of masters remembering apprentices in their wills, of apprentices staying on voluntarily after their contract ended, because the relationship had become genuinely important to both of them. And then there are the other records. Medieval guild archives are full of complaints, apprentices who ran away, masters who appeared before guild courts accused of withholding food, of excessive physical punishment, of failing to teach anything useful at all, and simply using the boy as domestic labour. One English document from the 14th century records an apprentice cobbler who fled his master's household after 2 years, citing that he had learned nothing about shoemaking and had spent his entire tenure cleaning the family's chambers. The guild took these complaints seriously, or tried to. Masters could be fined or stripped of the right to take future apprentices, but enforcement was inconsistent and the power imbalance was real. A 12-year-old boy, far from his family in a stranger's house, in a city he may barely know, he was not in a strong position to advocate for himself. And yet, most of them stayed, most of them endured, and most of them came out the other side with something genuinely valuable, a skill that could sustain them for the rest of their lives. I think about that resilience sometimes, and I honestly do not know whether to call it admirable or heartbreaking. Maybe it is both. Maybe those two things are not as separate as we like to think. Let us talk about what a boy actually learned during those years, because this is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. The apprenticeship was structured, though not in any written curriculum sense. There was no syllabus, no graded assignments, no midterm exam. Learning happened through proximity, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of observation and practice. You watched, you assisted, you tried, you failed, you tried again. Your master corrected you, sometimes patiently and sometimes not. And gradually over years the knowledge moved from his hands into yours. The earliest tasks were always the most menial. Keep the fire going, clean the tools, sweep the floor, fetch the water. These were not busy work, or not entirely. A forge that goes cold is a forge that has to be started from scratch, and starting a fire in the 13th century was not the effortless business of flicking a lighter. A set of tools left dirty will rust. A workshop floor covered in metal shavings or wood chips is a safety problem. The apprentice who learned to maintain the physical environment of his craft was learning something real, even when it did not feel like it. Over time, he was permitted to handle simpler tasks of the craft itself. The blacksmith's apprentice might begin by working the bellows, pumping air into the forge to keep the metal at the right temperature. This sounds simple. It is not. The temperature of a forge matters enormously. Too cool and the metal will not work properly. Too hot and it becomes brittle. Learning to read the colour of heated metal to know from the shade of orange or yellow or white exactly what it could and could not do took months of observation before it became instinct. The weaver's apprentice might begin by warping the loom, threading the vertical thread through the frame in exactly the right sequence. A mistake in the warp means flawed cloth from the very first pass of the shuttle. So you learned to be precise. You learned to count. You learned that your hands needed to remember what your mind was still working out. This is the part of the apprenticeship story that I find most quietly profound. Because what was being transmitted was not just technical knowledge. It was a way of paying attention, a standard of care, an understanding that the thing you make carries your name even when it does not literally have your name on it, and that your name means something. That is not a medieval idea. That is a human idea. And I think it is one we have been losing slowly and steadily for a long time. Can I ask you something? And I mean this genuinely, not rhetorically. When is the last time you made something with your hands? something that took real time, real patience and real skill, something that could have gone wrong and did not because you were careful. Think about it for a second. Because the apprentice in that medieval workshop, the one who was cold, tired, underpaid and probably a little homesick, he was building something inside himself with every single day. Not just knowledge of his craft, a relationship with patience itself. Now there is a dimension of the apprenticeship that most general histories completely skip over, and I think it is one of the most interesting parts of the whole system, the social dimension. When a boy entered a master's household as an apprentice, he did not just enter a workplace. He entered a family or something that functioned very much like one. He ate with the household. He slept in the house, usually in the workshop space or in a small chamber near it. He participated in the rhythms of domestic life. He observed how the master's wife managed the household economy. He knew which customers were valued and which were difficult. He understood over time the financial pressures his master faced, the cost of raw materials, the debts owed, the seasonal fluctuations in demand. This was an education in running a business that no classroom could have provided, and it was completely informal, completely embedded in daily life, completely invisible in any official curriculum. In fact, historians who study medieval apprenticeship have noted something striking. By the end of a successful apprenticeship, the young journeyman who emerged did not just know how to practice his craft. He knew how to operate within a social and economic network. He had relationships with suppliers, with customers, with fellow craftsmen, with guild officials. He had a reputation modest but real established through years of observed behavior. In a world before references and formal credentials, that network and that reputation were everything. There is one more aspect of the contract of childhood I want to linger on before we move forward, because I think it tells us something true about human nature that is easy to miss. The emotional weight of the moment. We have the legal documents, we have the guild records, we have the court cases, but we do not have many first-person accounts from apprentices themselves, because most of them were not literate, not yet at 12 years old in the year 1200 and something. So we have to read between the lines. We have to imagine a father bringing his son to a master's workshop, signing the contract, handing over the fee money that probably took months to save, and then turning to leave. What did that feel like? For the father, who almost certainly believed he was doing the best thing possible for his child, providing a future that farming or labouring could never guarantee, and who was walking away from his boy anyway. For the mother, who may not even have been present for the signing, who perhaps said her goodbye the day before or the morning of, in a way that had to carry 7 years of distance in it, and for the boy himself. There is a particular kind of courage in that moment that I think we do not name often enough. Not the courage of battle or of dramatic sacrifice. The quieter courage of stepping into the unknown because someone you trust has told you it is worth it. The courage of a 12-year-old who picks up a broom on his first morning in a stranger's workshop and gets to work. That courage did not go unnoticed, not by the guild system and not by history. Because the boys who endured, who learned, who survived the 7 years and emerged as journeymen, they went on to build the physical world of medieval Europe. The shoes, the barrels, the iron tools, the cloth, the hinges on the cathedral doors, the copper pots in the kitchen, the candles that kept the darkness back. All of it made by hands that once held a broom for the first time in a workshop that smelled of someone else's life. And here is where the story takes a turn that most people do not see coming. Because completing the apprenticeship was not the end of the journey. It was not even close to the end. When the contract finally expired, when those 7 years were done, and the boy had become technically a young man, he did not graduate into freedom and independence and his own workshop. He became something in between, a journeyman. And the journeyman's life was stranger, harder, lonelier, and in some ways more remarkable than anything that had come before it. What it meant to be a journeyman in medieval Europe What it required, what it cost, and what it gave is a story I am genuinely eager to get into with you. Stay close. Close your eyes for a second, just for a moment. No alarm clock, no phone notification, no light creeping under the curtain from a street lamp, just darkness and cold, and the sound of a city that has not yet decided to wake up. Now imagine a sound cutting through that silence. Not a bell on your wrist, not a tone from a device on your nightstand. A bell hanging in a church tower, heavy iron, slightly uneven in its rhythm, ringing out across rooftops and narrow streets, and the still sleeping workshops of an entire medieval city. That bell is not asking you to get up. It is telling you. And if you are an apprentice in a guild workshop in, say, the city of Bruges in the year 1320, you are already supposed to be on your feet before it finishes ringing. This is how the day begins every day, without exception. We talk a lot in modern life about work-life balance, about boundaries, about protecting your time, and I think those conversations are genuinely important. But they become strangely surreal when you set them against the reality of a medieval craftsman's day, because the medieval working day operated on a logic so different from ours that it is almost a different concept entirely. There was no clock on the wall of a 13th century workshop. Not a mechanical one, those would not arrive in European cities until the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and even then they were rare, expensive, and not always reliable. Time in the medieval workshop was measured by light, by the position of the sun, by the sound of church bells ringing the canonical hours, the prayers that structured monastic life, and by extension, the rhythm of the entire town around the monastery walls. The working day began at sunrise. It ended generally when the light failed, and between those 2 points, guild regulations in many cities were remarkably specific about what was and was not permitted. Here is a detail that stops people every time I mention it in many guild charters across France, England, and the Low Countries. Working by artificial light, by candlelight or lamplight after dark, was explicitly forbidden. Not discouraged, forbidden, punishable by fine. Now you might think this was about fire safety. And yes, a workshop full of wood shavings and oil and textile dust lit by open flame is obviously a dangerous thing. But that was not the primary reason for the rule. The primary reason was quality. Artificial light in the medieval period was dim, uneven, and unreliable. A craftsman working by candlelight could not see well enough to maintain the standard the guild required, and a guild whose members produced substandard work in the dark was a guild whose reputation and whose monopoly was at risk. So they banned the dark, or rather they banned working in it. I find that genuinely remarkable. In an age when there were no labour inspectors in the modern sense, no regulatory agencies, no consumer protection boards, a group of craftsmen collectively decided that the quality of their work mattered more than the extra hours they could squeeze out of the night. They enforced that standard on themselves, through their own rules, their own courts, their own system of fines. That is not naivety. That is professional pride institutionalized. Let us walk through the day properly, because the details are worth having. Sunrise. The apprentice is up first always. In most workshops this meant somewhere between 5 and 6 in the morning during summer, later in winter when dawn came slow. The first tasks are the same regardless of the trade. The workshop must be prepared. The hearth must be lit, or if it was kept going overnight, stoked back to working temperature. Tools must be laid out in their proper order. If there are animals involved in the work, and in some trades there were, tanners working with hides, saddlers requiring leather, they must be attended to. Any materials left soaking or drying from the day before must be checked. This preparation phase was not nothing. It was in many ways the most important 20 minutes of the day. A blacksmith's forge that reached working temperature too slowly meant lost hours. A weaver's loom that had warped overnight from humidity meant the morning's first cloth would be ruined. The apprentice who learned to anticipate these things, who arrived at the workshop already thinking ahead, was the one who would eventually become a journeyman worth hiring. The master arrived to a workshop already in motion. This was the expectation, and in most households the reality. By the time the master had eaten his morning meal, and eating before work was not a given, in many accounts craftsmen worked for a period first and ate a proper breakfast. Mid-morning the fire was lit, the tools were ready, and the apprentice was already occupied with preparatory work. Then the actual craft began. And this is where things get interesting, because what work looked like varied so dramatically between trades that it almost defies summary. Take the blacksmith. In a city forge in the 14th century, the working environment was physically brutal by any standard. The forge itself burned at temperatures that a modern thermometer would read at somewhere between 1000 and 1300 degrees Celsius, hot enough to bring iron to a workable state, hot enough to cause serious injury in an instant. The smith worked, standing, always moving the rhythm of hammer on anvil, steady and demanding. The sound alone was exhausting, a constant percussive clang that rang through the bones rather than just the ears. Visitors to medieval cities consistently mentioned the sound of the smith's quarter, audible from streets away, as one of the defining sounds of urban life. And yet smiths were not just brute force. Far from it. A good blacksmith was a metallurgist in practice, even if he never used that word. He knew from the colour of heated iron exactly what temperature he was working at, and what the metal could tolerate. Orange-red meant one thing, yellow-white meant another. He knew which hammering techniques would strengthen the metal, and which would make it brittle. He knew how to plunge hot metal into water or oil to achieve different finishes, different hardnesses. He knew in his hands and his gut things that would not be written into chemistry textbooks for another 5 centuries. The apprentice in that forge spent years just learning to see what the master saw when he looked at a piece of heated iron. That is not an exaggeration. That visual literacy, reading metal by colour, reading wood by grain, reading cloth by drape, was the core skill of every medieval craft, and it could not be taught from a book. It lived in the eyes, and the eyes learned through thousands of hours of watching. Now shift the scene entirely, same city, different street. A weaving workshop. In Ghent perhaps, or in the wool districts of Florence, the 2 great cloth-making centres of the medieval world. The atmosphere here is utterly different from the forge. No fire, no hammering, no heat beyond the warmth of bodies working in a close space. Instead, the rhythmic clacking of looms, the soft scrape of shuttles moving through warp threads, the occasional snap of a thread breaking, and the brief pause while it is repaired and retied. The sound of a weaving workshop is almost meditative. I've read accounts from people who visited such places in the late medieval period and described the sound as hypnotic, a steady mechanical rhythm that filled the room completely like rain on a roof. But do not let that lull you into imagining it was easy work. Weaving demanded a particular kind of physical endurance. The weaver sat for hours at a time, her and I use her deliberately, because textile work was one of the areas where women were heavily represented in the workforce, both as workers and in some cities as masters, her feet working the treadles that controlled the warp threads, while her hands threw the shuttle back and forth through the shed. The motion was repetitive, but it required constant attention. A mistake in the pattern, a missed treadle, a misthrown shuttle could mean feet of cloth that had to be unravelled and redone. And in a system where the guild inspected the finished cloth before it could be sold, a weaver who produced effective work was not just embarrassed. She was fined. Weaving apprentices spent their first months learning to warp the loom, an extraordinarily tedious process of threading hundreds of vertical threads through a heddle and reed in exactly the right sequence. A warp wrongly set means every single row of cloth that follows will carry the error. So you learn to be obsessively precise before you are allowed to weave a single row. Somewhere between mid-morning and midday, the workshop stopped for a meal. This was not the hurried desk lunch of modern working life. It was a genuine pause, often the largest meal of the day, in terms of both quantity and social significance. Guild regulations in some cities actually specified minimum meal times. In Paris in the 13th century, certain trades were required to allow workers a proper midday break, not because medieval guildmasters were especially progressive about worker welfare, but because a worker who ate adequately and rested briefly was a more productive worker in the afternoon. The food itself was modest by any standard we would recognize today. Bread dark, dense filling was the foundation of almost every meal. Pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables and grains were available, simmered over the fire throughout the day in most households and served morning, midday and evening. Ale was drunk more commonly than water, not because medieval people were constantly mildly intoxicated, though some historians have had spirited debates about this, but because the brewing process made ale safer to drink than the water sources available in most medieval cities. Meat appeared on the table more often for craftsmen than for rural labourers, especially in cities where butchers and markets made fresh food reasonably accessible. But it was still a luxury on most days, not a staple. Fish salted, dried or fresh, depending on the city's proximity to water, appeared frequently. Cheese, legumes, seasonal vegetables. The diet was plain repetitive and almost entirely local in its ingredients. And yet on feast days, and this is important because it changes the picture considerably, the table looked very different. Here is a piece of medieval reality that surprises almost everyone who encounters it for the first time. Medieval craftsmen, by our standards, did not work nearly as many days in a year as we do, which sounds wonderful until you understand what they did instead. The medieval calendar was structured around the liturgical year, the cycle of Christian feast days, saints' days, and religious observances that punctuated every month. In England, in the 14th century, there were somewhere between 40 and 50 official non-working days per year beyond Sundays. Some historians have counted higher depending on the city and the period. In strongly Catholic regions of France and Italy, the number was higher still. Think about that for a moment. Between Sundays and feast days, a medieval craftsman in a guild city might work something closer to 250 days per year than the 300 plus that modern workers typically put in. On the face of it, that sounds like a much better deal. But the comparison falls apart quickly when you look at what happened on those working days. Because when they worked with an intensity and a physical commitment that our cushioned, ergonomic, temperature-controlled modern workplaces make very difficult to fully imagine. No mechanical assistance, no power tools, no heated workshop in winter, no cooling system in summer, just human strength, human skill, and the materials in front of them, from the moment the light came up to the moment it failed. The feast days, meanwhile, were not rest in the modern sense. They were community obligations, mass processions, guild celebrations, family duties. The guild feast was a serious social event, not an optional extra. Missing it without good reason was the kind of thing people noticed and remembered. By late afternoon, the exact hour shifting with the season always calibrated to the failing lightwork stopped. Tools were cleaned and put away. The fire in the forge was managed down to coals or allowed to cool depending on the trade and the next day's plans. Apprentices completed their final duties, sweeping, organizing, checking that nothing had been left in a state that would create problems the following morning. The evenings were shorter than we imagined them. Without reliable artificial lighting, the rhythm of social life after dark was constrained. Taverns existed and were frequented. Guild records are full of incidents that began in taverns, which tells you something, but for most craftsmen, evening meant a meal, perhaps a brief period of conversation, or simple domestic tasks, and then sleep. Early sleep by our standards, because the bell was going to ring again. And here is something that genuinely fascinated me when I first came across it. There is evidence from medical and social writings of the period that medieval people in the northern parts of Europe, where winter nights were very long, often practiced what historians call segmented sleep. They would sleep for several hours after dark, wake naturally in the middle of the night, sometimes for an hour or two, of quiet activity, prayer, light work, conversation with a household member, and then return to sleep until dawn. This was not insomnia. It was considered completely normal. The idea of 8 unbroken hours of sleep as the single correct way to rest is, it turns out, a relatively modern invention. Medieval people slept differently, and their bodies appear to have adapted to the natural light cycle in ways that our electric-lit nights have made almost impossible. I find that oddly comforting. Like we've been told there is one right way to rest, and history is quietly clearing its throat to suggest otherwise. So what does all of this add up to? What does a day in a medieval guild workshop actually mean when you look at it whole? It means a life organised around craft in a way that most of us will never experience. Not craft as a hobby, not craft as self-expression, craft as the total architecture of your day, your relationships, your identity, your place in the world. You woke thinking about the work. You ate beside the work. You slept in the same building as the work. The boundaries we draw today between professional and personal, between productive and restful, between public and private, they barely existed. Whether that sounds appealing or suffocating probably says something about who you are. And I do not think there is a wrong answer, because the medieval craftsman would likely find our fragmented, screen-saturated, always connected but never quite present lives equally baffling. Different architectures of time, different ways of being human. But here is what I keep coming back to every time I sit with this material. The men and women who lived this daily rhythm, who got up before sunrise, who worked until the light was gone, who ate simple food and slept early and did it all again. The next day they built things that are still standing. Cathedrals, bridges, stained glass, illuminated manuscripts, carved choir stalls, wrought iron gates, objects of such extraordinary beauty and precision that modern craftspeople using modern tools still struggle to fully replicate them. That did not happen by accident. It happened because of the daily discipline of the workshop, because of a system that valued quality absolutely, that enforced standards mercilessly, and that asked of its members not just skill, but something harder to name, something closer to devotion. And yet, and this is the part that the daily schedule, the fire tending and the floor sweeping and the pottage eating, never quite prepares you for all of that discipline, all of that training, all of those years of careful daily work, was ultimately pointed toward a single moment. A moment that could make everything or destroy it completely. The secrets that held the guild together, the oaths that bound its members, the hidden knowledge that passed from masters' hands to apprentices' hands, in the dim light of workshops across medieval Europe, all of it existed to protect something. And understanding what that something was and what it cost to keep it changes everything about how you see the world these craftsmen built. That is where we are going next. There is a particular kind of power that has nothing to do with armies, or gold, or political office. It is quieter than all of those things, more patient. And in certain historical periods, it proved more durable than any of them. It is the power of knowing something that other people do not know, and being organized enough, disciplined enough, loyal enough to keep it that way. The medieval guild understood this power in its bones, not as a philosophy, not as a strategy written down in a charter, as a lived reality sworn to before God, enforced by community and passed from generation to generation, with a care that would put most modern corporations to shame. What we're talking about tonight is secrets, and what keeping them really cost. Let us start with something that surprises people every time. The Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, the organization that built cathedrals and crowned kings and held the moral authority of an entire civilization, was deeply suspicious of guilds. Not because guilds were criminal, not because they were heretical in the conventional sense, but because of what happened at guild gatherings, the oaths. In the 9th century, a Frankish bishop named Hinxmar of Reims wrote with obvious alarm about what he called the conjurations of early guild-like groups. These were binding oaths sworn among members, in some cases at late-night gatherings, over shared food and drink, promising mutual support in times of trouble, loyalty to the brotherhood above outside allegiances, and in some recorded instances commitments to defend one another in feuds and business disputes. The Church found this troubling for a very specific reason. These oaths created a loyalty structure that potentially competed with the loyalty structure of Christianity itself. You swore your deepest allegiance to God, to your Lord, to your King. Now here was an organization asking you to swear something equally binding to your fellow craftsmen. Hinxmar tried to Christianize the guilds. He wanted the oaths brought inside the Church's framework, the feast turned into properly sanctioned religious observances, the brotherhood subordinated to proper ecclesiastical authority. He mostly failed. The guilds absorbed enough religious language and ritual to satisfy the letter of the Church's concerns: guild chapels, patron saints, feast day observances, prayers before work began. But the core loyalty structure, the brother-to-brother oath, the commitment to protect the secrets of the trade from all outsiders, remained essentially intact. It just wore better clothes. So what were these secrets exactly? This is where the history gets genuinely interesting, and where I think most people underestimate what was actually at stake. We tend to think of trade secrets in modern terms: proprietary formulas, patented processes, confidential business strategies, things that belong to corporations and are protected by lawyers and non-disclosure agreements. That framing makes trade secrets feel impersonal, transactional, commercial. In the medieval guild, a trade secret was something entirely different. It was knowledge that had been accumulated over generations, refined through years of trial and painful failure, and transmitted through the almost impossibly inefficient but surprisingly robust medium of direct human teaching. It lived in hands and eyes before it lived anywhere else, and it could not be reconstructed from scratch. If it was lost, if the chain of transmission broke, it was simply gone. Think about what that means. The dyers of Florence and Bruges knew things about colour that took centuries to develop. The particular sequence of mordant's chemical compounds used to fix dye to fabric that produced a specific shade of crimson, or azure, or deep forest green. The timing, the temperature of the dye bath, the quality of water, and how it affected the final colour. The way certain plant-based dyes interacted with wool versus linen versus silk. These were not things you could look up. There was no book. There was no university course. There was a master dyer and there was an apprentice watching, and there was years of accumulated embodied knowledge moving between them. In the city of Bruges in the 14th century, the Dyers' Guild was protecting formulas that gave Flemish cloth a quality and colour consistency that made it the most prized textile in Europe. Merchants from Venice, from the Byzantine Empire, from the trading cities of North Africa paid premium prices specifically for Bruges cloth. That reputation and that income rested entirely on trade secrets that the guild guarded with something close to ferocity. If a member revealed those formulas to an outsider, or to a competitor from another city, or simply allowed an unauthorized person to observe the dyeing process too closely, the consequences were severe. Fines, exclusion from the guild, in extreme cases something close to professional destruction. The community that had been your entire social world would close its doors to you. That is not a small thing. In medieval Europe, to be excluded from your guild was to lose not just your livelihood but your identity, your place in the social order, your future. Let me give you a concrete example that I find almost cinematic in its specificity. The stained glass workshops of medieval France, particularly the great ateliers that produced the windows of Chartres of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, of the cathedrals of Reims and Amiens, held formulas for producing coloured glass that remained genuinely mysterious to outsiders for centuries. The deep ruby red, the cobalt blue, the rich golden amber that floods those naves with light on a clear morning. Modern glassmakers have analysed these windows extensively, and scholars understand now, in broad terms, what metallic oxides produced which colours, but the specific ratios, the particular temperatures, the sequence of additions to the molten glass, the cooling methods that prevented the colour from going flat or streaky or opaque rather than luminous. Those details lived in the workshop in the hands of the master glassmakers, passed to apprentices who were permitted to see the process only after years of demonstrated trustworthiness. Chartres Cathedral has 176 stained glass windows. Some of them date to the 12th and 13th centuries. They have survived wars, revolutions, deliberate destruction, and 8 centuries of weather. And scholars who study them report that the quality of colour in the oldest windows, the ones made when the guild knowledge was freshest and most complete, has never been fully replicated. Not in 800 years of trying. That is what a trade secret looks like when it is genuinely protected and genuinely lost. But here is the tension at the heart of the whole secret-keeping enterprise, and it is one that I do not think gets enough attention. Secrets require trust to keep, and trust in a human community is fragile. The guild system tried to solve this problem through several overlapping mechanisms. First, the length of the apprenticeship itself. 7 years is a long time to observe a person. By the end of it, you knew the apprentice's character quite well, his loyalties, his temper, his attitude toward the craft, his relationships outside the workshop. The decision to reveal the deeper secrets of the trade was not made at the moment of signing the contract. It was made gradually over years, as trust accumulated. Second, the oath. When an apprentice was advanced to journeyman status, when the guild formally admitted him into full membership, he swore, in front of witnesses, with his hand on whatever religious text carried the most weight in his community. He swore to protect the secrets of the craft, to work to the standards of the guild, to support his fellow members, and to submit to the guild's authority in matters of professional conduct. This was not a formality. Medieval oaths were understood, genuinely, viscerally understood, to have spiritual consequences. Breaking an oath sworn before God was not just a social or legal transgression, it was a sin. It carried implications that extended in the worldview of the time beyond death. This sounds extreme from a modern secular perspective, but for the people taking those oaths it was real, and it was effective. Third, and this is the mechanism that I find most psychologically fascinating, the guild created an identity so complete, so all-encompassing, that betraying it felt like betraying yourself. You were not just a member of the Weavers' Guild. You were a weaver. It was in your clothes, in the calluses on your hands, in the neighbourhood where you lived, in the church, where your guild had its chapel, in the feast days you celebrated, in the language you used to talk about your work. The guild was not an organisation you belonged to. It was a world you inhabited, and secrets are much easier to keep when revealing them would mean destroying the world you live in. There is a psychological concept that modern researchers call social identity theory, the idea that we derive a significant part of our sense of self from the groups we belong to. When our group's reputation is threatened, we feel it as a personal threat. When our group succeeds, we feel it as personal success. Medieval guild members never read a word of social psychology, but they built institutions that understood this dynamic with almost architectural precision. The brotherhood was designed to make your professional identity and your personal identity inseparable, because a craftsman who felt that way about his guild was a craftsman who would never under almost any circumstances compromise its secrets. Is that manipulation, maybe? Is it also a genuinely powerful way to build community and sustain excellence across generations? Absolutely yes. I think about this when I look at modern professional cultures, the loyalty that certain companies, certain law firms, certain medical institutions inspire in their people. The ones that work, the ones where people genuinely pour themselves into the work and protect the institution's standards with real passion. They have usually consciously or not figured out something similar. Not through oaths, usually, but through identity, through belonging. The guild knew this 1,000 years ago. Now let us complicate the picture a little, because I would be doing the history a disservice if I presented the guild's secrecy as purely noble and purely effective. It was neither. The same mechanisms that protected genuine craft knowledge also protected mediocrity. A guild that controlled who could enter the trade and controlled it with oaths and fees and family connections could keep out not just outsiders who lacked skill, but outsiders who had better ideas. The secrecy that preserved the stained glass formulas of Chartres also in other times and other contexts, preserved outdated techniques simply because questioning them felt like questioning the Brotherhood itself. There are documented cases from guild archives of masters being brought before guild courts, not because their work was substandard, but because they had introduced a new technique, a more efficient method, a different tool, an innovation borrowed from a craftsman in another city without guild approval. The guild's relationship with innovation was complicated and not always flattering, and the oaths could be used coercively. A journeyman who had witnessed something irregular in a master's workshop, a shortcut taken, a material substituted, a measurement falsified, was bound by the same oath that was supposed to protect the guild. Silence in that context was not loyalty, it was complicity, and the guild records suggest that silence usually won. This is the shadow side of brotherhood, and it is real and it matters, and it does not make the guild system less fascinating. It makes it more human. Let me share one more detail before we move on, because I think it illuminates something about the guild's secret life that is genuinely unexpected. The guilds were not universally secretive about everything. In fact, many guilds actively cultivated visibility and spectacle when it served their interests. Guild feast days were public events. Guild processions through city streets were elaborate competitive affairs with different guilds trying to outdo one another in the richness of their banners, the quality of their musicians, the grandeur of their displays. The Goldsmiths Guild of London, for example, participated in civic pageants with a showiness that bordered on theatrical. The secrets were specific. They were about process, not product. About how things were made, not what they looked like when finished. The finished object, the cloth, the blade, the glass window, the leather shoe was meant to be seen by everyone. Its quality was the guild's advertisement. Its excellence was the point. What was hidden was the path from raw material to finished object. The gap between the wool on the sheep's back and the crimson cloth on a merchant's table. The gap between the lump of iron ore and the blade that could hold an edge through a season's hard use. That gap was the guild's territory, and they guarded it like sovereign land. In a way, the guilds had invented something that we take completely for granted today, and rarely think about: the distinction between trade process and commercial product. The idea that you can show the world what you make while keeping private how you make it. Every technology company that has ever kept its algorithm proprietary, every pharmaceutical company that guards its synthesis process while selling the finished drug publicly, every chef who plates a beautiful dish without ever sharing the exact recipe. They are all, without knowing it, operating on a principle that was formalized in medieval guild charters hundreds of years before anyone invented the word intellectual property. The guild craftsmen figured it out with wax seals and sworn oaths and the threat of spiritual consequences. We figured it out with lawyers. I genuinely do not know which approach was more effective, but I have my suspicions. The oaths, the secrets, the brotherhood, the patron saints, the feast day rituals, all of it was in service of something that we have not quite named yet. Something that sat at the center of every guild craftsman's professional life, like a fixed point, a destination, a test that everything else was preparing him for. A single object, made alone, judged by a room full of masters who had every incentive to be exacting, and some incentive to be worse than that. The masterpiece. That word gets used casually. Now we call movies masterpieces, we call songs masterpieces, we call a particularly good meal a masterpiece if we are feeling generous. But in the world of the medieval guild, a masterpiece was not a compliment. It was a formal procedure, a threshold, a door that either opened or stayed shut, and on which side of that door you ended up determined the entire trajectory of the rest of your life, and the full story of what it actually meant to attempt one, what it cost, what it required, what it felt like to stand before the guild and be judged, is something worth taking the time to sit with properly, which is exactly what we are about to do. Imagine spending 7 years preparing for a single afternoon. Not 7 years of studying for an exam. Not 7 years working toward a promotion that your boss might eventually approve. 7 years of living inside someone else's household, eating someone else's food, waking before dawn to tend someone else's fire, learning a craft through the slow accumulation of 10,000 small corrections, and then at the end of all of it being told that your entire future will be decided by one object that you must make alone, submit to a room full of the most exacting judges imaginable, and then wait, just wait, while they look at it, and talk among themselves, and decide. That was the masterpiece. And if you think the word has lost some of its weight in the centuries since, if it sounds too familiar, too casually deployed in modern conversation, I want to spend some time tonight restoring it. Because what a masterpiece actually was in the world of the medieval guild was something far more consequential, far more human, and far more complicated than the word suggests today. Let us set the scene properly. The candidate, a journeyman who has completed his apprenticeship, worked for years under various masters, saved money, built a reputation, and finally decided he is ready, presents himself before the guild. In many cities this involved a formal application, a payment of fees, and a period of waiting while the guild decided whether to permit the attempt at all. That last detail matters. The guild did not let just anyone attempt a masterpiece. You had to be deemed worthy of the attempt before you were allowed to make it, which meant that the judgment did not begin when you set down the finished object on the table. It began the moment you asked permission to try. In the city of Paris in the 13th century, under the guild regulations recorded by Etienne Boileau in his remarkable compilation of trade rules known as the Book of Trades, a document that gives us an extraordinary window into how these systems actually worked. The requirements for advancement to master status in various trades were written out with a specificity that is almost startling. The knife makers required a candidate to produce a specific set of items demonstrating different techniques. The glovers required work in different materials. The jewelers required evidence of competence in multiple aspects of the craft, from setting stones to working in different metals. The rules were not identical across trades, but the structure was always the same. You made something, it was judged. The judgment was final. Here is what that judgment room might have looked like. A hall or a large room in the guild's meeting house, Morning light probably, because daylight was the standard by which all work was assessed. We talked about that earlier, and it applied here with particular force. The guildmasters seated at a table or arranged in a way that made their authority spatially clear. The candidate present but not seated, this was not a comfortable conversation between equals. This was a formal proceeding, the masterpiece placed before them, and then the silence while they looked at it. Depending on the trade, what they were looking at might be a lock, and its accompanying key constructed to fit together with a precision that would have been remarkable without power tools. It might be a length of cloth woven to a specific width, in a specific pattern, with an evenness of thread and colour that could only come from years of practice. It might be a pair of shoes assembled from leather cut to exact dimensions, with stitching so regular and tight that it would hold through years of hard use. It might be a piece of metalwork, a clasp, a hinge, a decorative fitting finished to a standard that left no visible tool marks, no rough edges, no evidence of hesitation. The masters examined everything, the front and the back, the inside where no one would ever see it in normal use, the joints, the seams, the finishing. They ran their hands over surfaces. They tested moving parts for smoothness and precision. They held cloth up to the light and looked through it for inconsistencies. They checked measurements against guild standards. They were not looking for perfection in an abstract sense. They were looking for evidence of mastery, which is a subtly different thing. Mastery in this context meant that the craftsman had so thoroughly internalized the standards of the guild that he could reproduce them reliably alone under pressure without anyone to correct him. Not a lucky good day, not his best work ever produced under ideal conditions, work that demonstrated consistent, reproducible excellence. That distinction is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes what the masterpiece was really testing. It was not testing whether you could make one beautiful thing. It was testing whether you had become the kind of person who could make beautiful things consistently, and that is a much harder thing to demonstrate. Anyone can have a good day. Anyone can, with sufficient care and favourable circumstances, produce something exceptional once. What the guild was asking, what that room full of masters with their quiet assessing eyes was asking, was whether the craft had become part of you. Whether it was in your hands so deeply that it came out even when you were nervous, even when the light was not ideal, even when everything was at stake. I find that genuinely moving. As a standard to hold yourself to it is both brutal and beautiful. Now for the part that the romantic version of this story tends to leave out. Money. Becoming a master was not just about skill, it was about capital. And for many journeymen, perhaps most, the financial barrier was as formidable as the technical one. The fees involved in a masterpiece attempt were substantial. You had to pay the guild for the privilege of submitting. You had to pay for the materials you used in making the piece, and in certain trades those materials were expensive. A goldsmith's masterpiece required actual gold. A jeweller needed stones. A silversmith needed silver. The money came out of your own pocket, and if the attempt failed, you had spent it for nothing. But the deeper financial reality was this: to become a master craftsman, you needed to be able to open and operate your own workshop. You needed premises. You needed tools, not borrowed tools, your own. You needed enough capital to purchase raw materials before you had sold the finished goods. You needed, in many trades, to have arrangements in place with suppliers and customers before you could realistically operate as an independent business. In the cities of 14th century Flanders, where the textile industry was generating extraordinary wealth at the master level, the cost of setting up a weaving workshop loom, ancillary equipment, initial raw materials workshop rental was the equivalent of several years of a journeyman's wages, saved in entirety, before a single piece of cloth could be produced for sale. For a journeyman from a modest family without connections to wealthy patrons or relatives already established in the trade, that sum was staggering. Not impossible, but the kind of thing that required years of careful saving and often strategic marriage. It was not uncommon for a journeyman to marry the widow of a deceased master craftsman not only out of romantic feeling, but because the widow had inherited the workshop, the tools, the customer relationships, and the standing in the guild. A marriage like that was in effect a business acquisition, and both parties often understood it as such. The guild in its own records was fairly matter-of-fact about this. The aspiring master needed to demonstrate not just technical competence, but proof of wealth and social position. Skill was necessary but not sufficient. You also had to be the kind of person the guild was comfortable having as a full member, which meant in practice the kind of person who had money or access to money, or was related to someone who did. And this is where the system reveals its deepest fault line. The one that if you pull on it hard enough starts to unravel the guild's idealistic self-presentation considerably. The masterpiece system was supposed to be meritocratic. That was its moral claim. The best work wins. Skill determines who rises. In a medieval world stratified in almost every other way by birth, blood, and inherited position, the guild offered something remarkable, a ladder that could theoretically be climbed by anyone with sufficient talent and dedication. In practice, it was nothing like that clean. By the 15th century, in many guild cities across Europe, the masterpiece requirement had become almost secondary to the question of who you were related to. Sons of existing masters were exempted from fees that outside candidates had to pay. In some guilds, they were exempted from the masterpiece requirement entirely, or held to a significantly lower standard. The guild, which had originally positioned itself as an open meritocracy, had gradually transformed into something closer to a hereditary guild. A professional aristocracy, entry controlled not primarily by skill but by family, and the limitation on the number of masters operating in any given city, a rule that existed to prevent market saturation and price collapse, which was a genuinely legitimate economic concern, meant that even a journeyman who produced an impeccable masterpiece might be told politely that there were no vacancies. Come back when someone dies. This actually happened. There are guild records of journeymen who produced masterpieces that were formally accepted as technically excellent, and who were then placed on waiting lists for master positions that might not open for years. Some of them waited so long that they grew old in journeyman status. Some of them gave up entirely, moved to different cities, tried again under different guild jurisdictions. Some of them, and this is the quietly heartbreaking part, simply never made it. Spent their entire working lives as journeymen, competent and respected, and permanently one step below the threshold they had worked towards since childhood. Does that make you angry? It should a little. But I want to offer a counterweight because history is rarely satisfying when it only goes in one direction. The masterpiece system, for all its inequities and its creeping nepotism and its financial gatekeeping, it produced something real, something tangible, something you can still go and look at today in museums and cathedrals and historic buildings across Europe and be genuinely stopped in your tracks by the armour of the 15th century. Not the crude stuff of early medieval warfare, but the full plate armour of the late Gothic period, the kind produced in the great armourers' workshops of Milan and Augsburg cities, whose guild systems were among the most rigorous in Europe. Armour that covered the entire body in articulated plates, each piece curved to deflect blows, each joint designed to allow full freedom of movement. The whole assembly fitted to a specific person's body with a precision that modern replica makers with modern tools still find genuinely challenging to match. The goldsmith's work of the 13th and 14th centuries reliquaries, chalices, decorative objects of a delicacy and intricacy that require magnification to fully appreciate. made by hands with hand tools by craftsmen working in dim light, producing objects of such technical mastery that researchers studying them today occasionally simply stop and sit with the fact that they exist. The timber frame buildings of medieval England and France and Germany, built by carpenters whose joinery, the way they cut and fitted the wood together without metal fasteners, using only the geometry of the wood itself to create joints that would hold for centuries, is still used as a teaching model in architectural conservation programs. All of that came from the masterpiece system, from the insistence that excellence was not a nice to have, from the room full of judges who looked at your work and either nodded or did not, and from whose verdict there was no appeal. There is one more dimension of the masterpiece that I want to bring in because I think it is the most psychologically rich of all. The guild kept the masterpiece. After a journeyman successfully presented his work and was accepted as a master, the object he had made, the thing he had poured years of preparation into, the thing that represented the best of what he knew, how to do the thing that had been under those examining eyes and survived, was retained by the guild. It did not go home with him. It belonged to the guild now. Think about what that meant. Your masterpiece was a kind of admission price. You gave it in exchange for the right to use your own skills in the world. The guild held it, presumably displayed it, or stored it, used it as a reference standard, or a record of membership. I have read various interpretations of this practice, and most of them focus on the practical or institutional dimension. The guild building a collection of work that could serve as quality benchmarks, that could be used to settle disputes about standards that represented the accumulated excellence of the membership. But I keep coming back to the personal dimension, the one I never see fully articulated in the histories. What was it like to hand it over? You made it alone, you put everything you had into it, and then you gave it away to the organisation and walked out with a new title and an empty hands, and you went home and started building the next thing. The thing you would make as a master now in your own workshop for customers who would pay you, and send it out into the world and eventually forget who made it. The masterpiece was the last object you ever made purely for yourself, and you could not keep it. There is something in that I find genuinely affecting, and maybe you do too. This idea that the moment of your greatest achievement is also the moment you have to let it go. That the proof of who you have become is almost by definition not something you get to hold on to. It sounds almost like a parable, like something that belongs in a different kind of story. But it happened. Thousands of times across hundreds of years in workshops and guild halls in every city in medieval Europe. Young men, and occasionally young women, as we'll come to, standing in front of their judges, holding the best thing they had ever made and handing it over. And then turning around, walking back out into the street, and beginning the next chapter of a life that in every meaningful sense had just been transformed. That transformation, what came after the masterpiece, what a life as a journeyman on the road actually looked like for those who did not yet have the money or the connections to cross the threshold into mastery, is a story full of details that most people have never encountered. Because the journeyman who left his master's workshop and stepped out into the medieval world did not simply find the next available position in the next town and settle in. What he was required to do in some traditions, literally required by the guild system itself, was something far stranger, far lonelier, and in its own unexpected way far more formative than anything that had come before. He had to wander, and what that wandering looked like, what it demanded, and what it quietly gave to the people who survived it, that is exactly where we are heading next. Somewhere in the German-speaking lands on a road that has turned muddy with autumn rain, a young man is walking. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is going, which is to say he knows the direction the next town, the name of the master craftsman, whose workshop he hopes will take him on for a season. What he does not know is whether that master will have space for him, whether the town guild will permit him to work there, or how long he will stay before the road calls him onward again. He carries almost nothing. A small bundle of tools, the ones that belong to him, personally earned or saved for over years of journeyman work, a leather satchel with a change of clothing, and 2 documents folded carefully and kept close to his body, more valuable to him right now than anything else he owns. One is his lehrbrief, his certificate of apprenticeship documenting his name, his father's name, the name of the master who trained him the years he served, and the guild's formal endorsement of his completion. The other is his wanderboek, his wanderbook, a kind of passport through the world of the craft guilds with pages that will be stamped by local authorities and guild offices in every town he passes through, building a record of his journey that will eventually testify to his years of wider experience. He has been walking for 3 weeks. He will not stop walking, not truly stop, not return home for at least 3 years and 1 day. This was the Wanderjahre, the wander years, and understanding what it actually was, what it demanded, and what it quietly built in the people who undertook it, is one of the most unexpectedly resonant things I have encountered in all of my time spent in medieval history. The Wanderjahre was not in its origins a romantic tradition. It was a practical necessity that the guild system eventually formalized into something with genuine pedagogical intention. Here is the basic problem the guilds were trying to solve. A journeyman who had completed his apprenticeship with a single master in a single city knew his craft through that master's eyes. He had learned one way of doing things, one interpretation of the techniques, one set of aesthetic preferences, one approach to sourcing materials and dealing with customers. That was fine for producing consistent work within an established workshop. But it was not sufficient for someone who aspired to run his own workshop one day, training others, setting standards, navigating the full complexity of the craft in the wider world. The solution was enforced travel. Go out, work under different masters, see how they do it differently, absorb what is better, bring it back. In the German-speaking lands where the tradition was formalized most rigorously, the rules were specific to the point of seeming almost punitive. The journeyman was forbidden to return home during the wander years, and not just informally discouraged. The rule in many guild systems was that he could not travel within 50 kilometers of his hometown during the entire period. He was exiled from familiarity by design. He was also required to return with roughly the same amount of money he had set out with. No more. The point was emphatically not wealth accumulation. The point was experience, skill, and the broadening of professional perspective. A journeyman who came back significantly richer than he had left had either taken shortcuts or exploited situations in ways the guild did not sanction. The Wanderjahre was about the journey, not the destination, in a way that is almost aggressively literal. And the minimum duration of 3 years and 1 day was not arbitrary. 3 years was considered the minimum time in which a journeyman could realistically encounter enough different masters, different regional approaches, different material conditions to have genuinely broadened his understanding. The extra day was, I suspect, a psychological as much as a practical measure. It signalled that the commitment was serious, that the counting was exact, that this was not something to be rushed or abbreviated. What did the road actually look like, though? Because there is a tendency to picture the Wanderjahre in slightly picturesque terms, the young craftsman striding through sunlit medieval countryside, encountering colourful characters growing wiser with each new town. The reality was considerably more complicated. Medieval roads were poor by almost any standard. Rutted, muddy in rain, dusty in drought, frequently impassable in winter. Bridges were scarce and river crossings could be genuinely dangerous. Bandits existed, though the threat varied considerably by region and period. Inns were available in towns, but a journeyman travelling on a tight budget did not always have the means to use them, and hospitality from fellow guild members was one of the most practically important benefits of membership. This, by the way, is something that gets almost no attention in most histories of the guild system, but deserves a great deal more. When a journeyman arrived in a new town with his lehrbrief and his Wanderbuch, the local guild of his trade had an obligation, a formal written obligation in many cases, to assist him, to help him find work with a local master, or if no work was available, to provide him with a meal and a small sum to continue his journey. The travelling journeyman was, in a very real sense, a protected class within the guild network. His documents were his credentials and his passport and his claim on the Brotherhood's resources simultaneously. This created something remarkable, a professional network that spanned hundreds of miles across political boundaries, language differences, local law variations. A German carpenter travelling through France could present his Wanderbuch to the local carpenters' guild and be recognised as a legitimate professional even if his French was non-existent. The document spoke for him. The guild system spoke for him. That level of cross-border professional recognition was genuinely unusual for the medieval period. In a world where travel was difficult, where strangers were regarded with suspicion, where your rights and protections depended almost entirely on who you knew locally and what community you belonged to, having a document that translated your professional standing across geographic and cultural boundaries was extraordinary. Let me tell you about a specific aspect of the Wanderjahre that I find almost impossible to read about without feeling a kind of vertigo. The journeyman during his wander years was professionally and socially suspended between two states. He was no longer an apprentice, that phase was complete, that identity left behind. He was not yet a master, that identity still in the future, uncertain financially, out of reach for most. He was by the literal etymology of the word a man of the day. Someone paid by the day for the day's work, moving on before anyone could become too attached or too indifferent. This in-between state had its own particular loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation. The journeyman was rarely alone for long, always in workshops, always among other craftsmen, always moving through social environments. But the loneliness of impermanence, of never quite belonging to the place you were in because you already knew you would leave, of forming working relationships that were real and meaningful, and then rolling up your tools and walking away from them. The people who have written most movingly about this kind of experience are not medieval historians. They are modern travel writers, expatriates, military families, anyone who has spent extended periods living in places they know are temporary. The particular emotional texture of that life, the sharpness of observation that comes from knowing you will not be here long, the resistance to putting down roots that makes everything feel both vivid and slightly unreal, that texture is consistent across centuries and cultures. The journeymen of the 14th century felt it too. We know this not from explicit personal accounts which are scarce, but from guild documents that repeatedly address the social problems created by the journeyman's transient status. Rules about how long a journeyman could stay before being required to move on. Rules about what relationships, particularly romantic ones, a journeyman was permitted to form while travelling. Rules about gambling, about debt, about behaviour that might embarrass the guild in a town where its members were guests rather than established citizens. The journeyman had freedom, real freedom more than most people in medieval society ever experienced. The freedom to move, to choose his next employer, to see the world beyond his hometown's walls. But it was freedom that came packaged with loneliness and uncertainty, and the particular exhaustion of always being new. Here is a question I genuinely wonder about when I sit with this material. Would you have done it? Not the hardship of the medieval road specifically, but the principle of it. Setting off into the unknown for years deliberately with the explicit goal of being changed by what you encounter, knowing that when you came back you would be different, and that different might mean better, but would certainly mean you could never quite fit back into the life you left. Because that is really what the Wanderjahre was asking. Not just for professional development in some HR department sense, it was asking the journeyman to become someone his hometown would not entirely recognize, to be shaped by places and people he had not yet met. To trust that exposure to the unfamiliar would make him more capable, not less stable. That is a genuinely brave commitment, and it was required, not optional. Now the Wanderjahre was most fully developed and most rigorously documented in the German-speaking lands. But the underlying principle, the journeyman's period of travelling to gain wider experience before settling, existed across medieval Europe in various forms. In France, the equivalent tradition was called the Tour de France, nothing to do with bicycles, everything to do with the compagnonnage system, the French equivalent of the German journeyman tradition. French compagnons travelled a circuit of major cities, Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille, and others working with masters in each location, building a portfolio of experience that's recognised across the country. The French system developed its own elaborate ritual structure, its own initiation ceremonies, its own symbolic language, its own internal hierarchy. It became so entrenched in French craft culture that versions of it survived the revolution, survived industrialization, and continue in a recognized form to this day. There are French compagnons, journeymen, carpenters, stonemasons, roofers doing their tour of France right now in the 21st century, carrying on a tradition that traces its roots directly to the medieval guild world. I find that genuinely extraordinary. Not as a curiosity or a historical footnote, but as evidence of something real. When a tradition survives 600 years of radical social transformation, revolution, industrialization, 2 world wars, the digital age, it is surviving because it offers something that people keep finding valuable. Not just nostalgically, practically. The Tour de France in the compagnonnage sense is still producing craftspeople of exceptional skill. The people who come through that system are still sought after for restoration work on historic buildings, for fine carpentry and masonry, and roofing on structures that require the kind of knowledge and care that cannot be learned from a YouTube tutorial or a trade school certification program. That is the long tail of the Wanderjahre, still producing results centuries later in a world the original journeymen would not recognize in any other way. There is a detail from the documents of the German journeyman tradition that I want to share because I think it illuminates something about the values embedded in the system that often gets lost in the broader historical picture. The Wanderbuch, the Wander Book, was not just a passport, it was a record of character. When a journeyman arrived at a new guild office or a new master's workshop and presented his Wanderbuch, the receiving party would examine not just the stamps and certifications, but the notes written by previous masters. Those notes could include assessments of the journeyman's work quality, his reliability, his conduct, his attitude toward the craft and toward his colleagues. A journeyman who had left a previous position under poor circumstances, who had argued with a master, produced careless work, behaved in ways that reflected badly on the guild, might find those notes following him through the wander years like a shadow. This was reputation management in an era before professional references, before online reviews, before any of the modern infrastructure we use to assess trustworthiness. The Wanderbuch made a journeyman's professional history portable and legible across geographic boundaries, and it cut both ways. A journeyman who had worked diligently, who'd earned genuine praise from the masters he served, who had added value everywhere he went and left each position with goodwill intact. His Wanderbuch told that story too. It opened doors, it created opportunities, it built page by stamped page a professional identity that followed him not as a burden, but as an asset. Your reputation travelled with you. You could not outrun it, and you could not hide from it. All you could do was earn it carefully, one working day at a time. The wander years ended eventually. 3 years and a day was the minimum, but many journeymen travelled longer, 5 years, 7 years. whatever it took to feel ready to have saved enough to have found the right city or the right opportunity. And when they returned, if they returned, because some of them never quite made it back, absorbed into new cities, new communities, new lives that the road had opened for them, they came back carrying something that cannot really be quantified. Not just skills, not just techniques absorbed from different masters in different cities, something harder to name, a wideness of view, an understanding that there were many ways to be excellent, not just the one way their first master had shown them, a capacity for adaptation that had been built mile by mile and season by season into the architecture of who they were. The guild system, for all its faults and rigidities and financial gatekeeping and hereditary tendencies, got this one thing profoundly right. It understood that you cannot become a true master of anything from a single vantage point. That breadth of experience is not a distraction from depth, it is ultimately what makes depth possible. That the person who has seen different ways of solving the same problem is better equipped to solve it well than the person who has only ever known one approach. The Vandayar built craftsmen who'd been shaped by the world, not just by a single workshop, and the world they built in return still stands. But the road, for all its loneliness and its physical difficulty and its enforced impermanence, was not the hardest thing the guild world asked of some of its members. Because we've been talking so far almost exclusively about men. About boys who became apprentices, journeymen, who wandered craftsmen, who climbed toward master status through a system designed with them in mind. And that story is real and important and worth telling in full. But it is not the whole story. Running alongside it, sometimes within, it sometimes parallel to it, sometimes in direct tension with it, was another story entirely. One that the guild records hint at more than they document directly. One that required a different kind of courage, a different kind of persistence and a different kind of creativity to navigate. The story of the women who worked and organized and led, and occasionally even ran guilds of their own, in a world that had written the rules almost entirely without them in mind. That story has been waiting long enough. Her name does not appear in most history books, and yet she was there. Every single day in workshops across Paris and London and Cologne and Florence, her hands were shaping the cloth, running the accounts, managing the supply of raw materials, training the next generation of workers. Her knowledge was real. Her labour was essential. Her contribution to the physical and economic world of medieval Europe was by any honest accounting enormous. The reason her name does not appear in most history books is not primarily that the records were lost. It is that the records were kept by people who'd already decided before they picked up the quill that her story was not the main story, that she was context, not content, background, not subject. Tonight I want to correct that. Not by inventing a story and not by romanticizing one. By going back to the records that do exist, and there are more of them than most people realize, and letting them speak plainly about what women in the medieval guild world actually did, and what it cost them and what they built despite it. Let us start with the number that tends to stop people cold when they first encounter it. In the city of Paris in the middle of the 13th century, the guild regulations compiled by Étienne Boileau, that remarkable royal official who spent years cataloguing the rules of over 100 Parisian trades, document something that flies directly in the face of the standard historical narrative. 5 of the city's guilds were female monopolies, not guilds where women were tolerated or accommodated, guilds where women held exclusive authority, no men permitted. These were primarily in the silk and textile trades, the silk spinners, the ribbon weavers, the makers of silk headbands and decorative cloth goods that were among the most commercially valuable luxury products in 13th century Paris. The women who ran these guilds were not operating in the margins of the economy. They were operating at its most profitable edge. silk goods destined for the wardrobes of French nobility, and the display tables of wealthy merchants across Europe made sold, and quality controlled entirely by female guild members operating under their own authority. Beyond those 5 female monopolies, Boileau's document notes that only a handful of Parisian guilds systematically excluded women. The rest, the majority, were officially open to women in some capacity: surgeons, glassblowers, chainmail forgers. These were not the soft trades, not the domestic trades. These were skilled, physically demanding, technically sophisticated crafts that required years of training and carried genuine professional status. And in the city of Rouen on the northern coast of France, the records are even more striking. In 7 of the city's 112 guilds, women had participated as full-fledged masters since the 13th century. Full masters, with the same rights and responsibilities as their male counterparts. The right to train apprentices to submit work for guild inspection, under their own name to vote in guild proceedings to represent the guild in dealings with the city government. 7 guilds in one city documented in writing. How many more existed without documentation? How many women operated at master level in trades, where the records simply did not think to note their sex because their presence was unremarkable? To the people keeping the records, we do not know. And that unknowing should sit with us. Now, I want to be honest about the limits here, because the history deserves honesty as much as it deserves recovery. The medieval guild world was not by any reasonable measure equitable toward women. The 5 female monopoly guilds in Paris and the 7 female master guilds in Rouen are real, documented and significant, but they existed within a broader system that was built primarily by and for men, and that reflected the legal and social framework of a society in which women's independent economic and legal standing was severely constrained. In most guild cities, a woman's ability to participate in guild life depended heavily on her marital status. A wife working in her husband's trade was participating under his guild membership, not her own. A daughter learning her father's craft was, legally speaking, an extension of the family workshop, not an independent practitioner. The guild's acknowledgement of her skills was real. She was doing the work, everyone knew she was doing the work, but the formal recognition of those skills, the membership, the voting rights, the title often belonged to the man whose household she was part of. The exception, the crack in the system wide enough for real female independence to slip through, was widowhood. When a master craftsman died, his wife often inherited not just his tools and his workshop, but his guild standing. In many guild systems across England, France and the German-speaking lands, the widow of a master was permitted to continue operating the workshop under the guild's protection for a defined period, typically until she remarried or until her own death. She could take on apprentices, she could hire journeymen, she could submit work for guild inspection and sale under the workshop's established name. In London in the 14th century, the records of the Goldsmiths' Guild document multiple widows who took over their late husbands' businesses and ran them successfully for years, sometimes decades. Not as caretakers, not as figureheads, but as operational masters who understood the trade, managed the finances, maintained the quality standards, and in at least some documented cases trained apprentices who went on to significant careers of their own. Those apprentices, if they ever wrote about their training, might have described their master without specifying the master's sex. In the records the name appears, the craft is described, the years of service are noted. But the word woman does not always appear because it was not always considered a relevant distinction by the person keeping the record. Which means we have been reading those records for centuries and not always seeing who was actually there. Let me tell you about the alewives of medieval England, because this is a story that I think captures better than almost any other example the complicated arc of women's economic power in the medieval period, how it worked, how it was gradually eroded, and what that erosion tells us about power and professional organisation more broadly. In 13th century England, brewing ale was overwhelmingly women's work. Not because men could not brew, because ale was produced at the household level as part of the domestic economy, and domestic production was women's domain. The woman who brewed a surplus batch and sold it from her doorstep, the alewife as she was called, was not doing something marginal or informal. She was supplying a genuine civic need. Ale was the primary safe drinking liquid in a period when water sources in towns and cities were frequently contaminated. People drank it at every meal, including breakfast. A functioning community required a reliable supply of ale, and in the 13th century that supply came almost entirely from women working in and around their homes. The alewife was not just an economic actor. She was a community institution. She knew her customers. She extended credit to those she trusted. She maintained a kind of informal social intelligence about the neighbourhood that passed through her door every day. The alehouse was in many communities the primary space of social gathering, dispute resolution and information exchange. And then gradually over the course of the 14th and 15th centuries things changed, as brewing became more commercially profitable, as the market for ale grew with growing urban populations, as the technical and capital requirements of larger-scale brewing increased. It became more attractive to organised guild-structured, predominantly male economic interests. The brewers' guilds that consolidated in English cities during this period were not explicitly designed to exclude women, but their organisational structure, their capital requirements, their apprenticeship systems, their political connections, all of these created barriers that effectively reduced female participation over time. By the 16th century, commercial brewing in English cities was largely a male-dominated industry. The alewives who had supplied ale to their communities for generations had been gradually edged out not by law, not by formal exclusion, but by the quiet structural pressure of an industry that reorganized itself in ways that happened to disadvantage the people who had built it. Does any of that sound familiar? I will leave that thought with you for a moment. The silk weavers of medieval Paris had a different experience, and it is worth dwelling on because it complicates any simple narrative about women in medieval craft. The female silk guilds of Paris were not just economically successful. They were, by the standards of their time and context, genuinely self-governing. They set their own standards. They enforced their own quality controls. They trained their own apprentices, all female, in the monopoly guilds. They negotiated with the city authorities as a recognized professional body. When disputes arose within the guild, they adjudicated them through their own internal processes. The women who ran these guilds understood quality as a professional standard, not as a domestic virtue. They understood their trade as a source of economic power and social identity, not just as an extension of household skill. And they protected their guild's interests through guild courts, through petitions to royal authority, through the same mechanisms that male guilds used to protect theirs, with a competence and persistence that the surviving records document clearly. One of the things that strikes me most about these women reading between the lines of the guild records is how strategically intelligent they were about operating within a system that had not been designed with them in mind. They found the gaps. They used the spaces the system left available. They built real authority in domains where the male-dominated structure happened not to have looked, or not to have looked carefully enough. That is not a story of passive survival. That is a story of active navigation, of women who understood the rules of the game well enough to find the moves the rulebook had forgotten to prohibit. There is a category of women in the guild world that the records mention more obliquely, but that was probably more common than the documented examples suggest. The craftswomen who worked within family workshops without ever receiving formal guild recognition for their own skills. The blacksmith's wife who managed the workshop accounts, tracked inventory, dealt with suppliers, and filled customer orders during the periods when her husband was ill or travelling. the carpenter's daughter who learned to cut joints and raise frames alongside her brothers, whose work went out into the world under the family workshop's name. The embroiderer's niece who designed the patterns that the household produced but whose creative contribution was attributed to the established master at the head of the enterprise. These women were economically active. They were skilled. They were in many cases doing work that was indistinguishable in quality from the work of formally recognized craftsmen. But the formal structure of the guild system did not have a clean category for them. They existed in the productive space of the workshop doing essential work while the official records organized themselves around a framework that tended not to see them. And yet the work was done. The products went out, the workshops functioned, the cathedrals were built and the cloth was woven and the shoes were made and the accounts were balanced. All of this happened in part because of labour that the guild system simultaneously relied on and failed to formally acknowledge. That particular paradox, indispensable and invisible at the same time, is not unique to medieval Europe. But medieval Europe is where we can trace it in remarkable documentary detail, if we know where to look and what to look for. Here is what I want to offer as a kind of provisional conclusion to this part of the story before we move on to a place in the guild world where power and politics and economics collided in ways that shaped entire cities. The history of women in the medieval guild world is not a history of absence. It is a history of presence under conditions of constraint, of skill exercised in spaces that were officially narrow but practically wider than they appeared, of economic contribution that was real and substantial and foundational, and that has been systematically underrepresented in the stories we tell about the period. The 5 female monopoly guilds in Paris are real. The 7 female master guilds in Rouen are real. The alewives of England are real. The silk weavers and the goldsmiths' widows and the workshop wives and daughters who kept things running are real. They built the medieval world too. With their hands, their knowledge, their organizational intelligence, their willingness to work within a system that was imperfect and find the places where they could operate with genuine authority. The fact that most of their names did not make it into the prominent histories is a failure of historiography, not a reflection of their significance. And speaking of power, because the guild world, for all the intimate human stories it contains, was also a political force of remarkable consequence. There is a dimension of the guild's public life that we have not yet touched. The guild hall, the place where the brotherhood gathered, where disputes were settled, where feasts were held, where political decisions were made that could shake a city's government to its foundations, where craftsmen who had spent their days bent over workbenches stood up, looked the city's ruling class in the eye, and occasionally told them exactly what they thought. Because the guild was not just an economic institution. In certain times, in certain cities, it was a revolutionary one. And that story of ordinary craftsmen who built not just objects but political power, who shook the foundations of medieval city governments, and in some cases rewrote the rules entirely, is one of the most gripping chapters in this whole long journey. Let us walk into the guild hall together. Walk into almost any historic city in Northern Europe today, Bruges, Ghent, York, Cologne, Frankfurt, Tallinn, and at some point, if you're paying attention, you will stop in front of a building that feels different from the ones around it. Not a cathedral, not a castle, not a palace. Something altogether more interesting in a way. A building that was built not by kings or by God, but by craftsmen, by tanners and weavers and goldsmiths and carpenters who pooled their resources, hired the best architects their collective wealth could afford, and constructed something that said in stone and wood and ornamental detail exactly what they wanted it to say. We are here, we have power, and we intend to keep it. The guild hall was the most tangible expression of something that the guild system produced almost by accident, or rather produced as an inevitable consequence of organizing craftsmen into coherent, funded, legally recognized institutions. It produced political ambition. Not just the ambition to make good cloth or fine metalwork, the ambition to shape the city itself, to sit at the table where decisions were made, to matter in the fullest sense of that word beyond the walls of the workshop. Let us establish what the Guildhall actually was before we get into what happened inside it, because the physical reality is striking enough to deserve a moment. By the 13th and 14th centuries in prosperous guild cities across Flanders, the Rhineland and the Baltic coast guildhalls had become architectural statements of considerable ambition. The great cloth hall of Ypres, begun in the 13th century, was at the time of its completion one of the largest secular buildings in medieval Europe, longer than a football field, with a belfry tower that rose over 70 metres above the market square. It was not a building that was trying to be modest, it was a building that was trying to be dominant, and it succeeded. In Bruges, the Guildhall of the Free Fishmongers stood in a city that had made itself one of the wealthiest trading centres in the known world. The Goldsmiths' Hall in London occupied prime real estate in the heart of the city. In Frankfurt, the guild halls of the major trades faced the market square in a display of collective prosperity that was explicitly competitive, each guild trying to signal through the quality and scale of its building that it was more prosperous, more established, and more powerful than its neighbours. This was not vanity, or not only vanity, it was communication. In a world without newspapers, without mass media, without any of the modern channels through which institutions signal their credibility and authority, a building was one of the most powerful messages an organisation could send. You could look at a guild hall and know without being told that the people who built it had money, had organisation, had staying power, and had the confidence to spend significant resources on the long-term statement of their collective identity. Inside those walls, the life of the guild was rich and strange and surprisingly varied. The most obvious function was administrative. The guild hall was where the guild's governing body, the guild masters, the elected officers, the aldermen of the craft met to conduct the business of the organisation, setting prices, resolving disputes between members, hearing complaints from customers, reviewing applications for membership, adjudicating accusations of substandard work or rule violations, all the unglamorous machinery of professional self-governance that kept the whole system running. But the hall was also where the guild feasted. And I want to spend a moment on the feasts because they tell us something important about how the guild understood itself, not just as an economic organisation, but as a community of people who were invested in each other's lives in ways that went beyond professional interest. Guild feast days were not optional. They were civic and religious obligations tied to the feast day of the guild's patron saint, to the anniversary of the guild's founding charter, to the major dates of the Christian calendar that structured the medieval year. And they were by the accounts that survived genuinely celebratory events. Long tables, good food considerably better than the daily pottage and bread that most craftsmen ate on working days, ale and wine in quantities that guild account books record with a candour that's occasionally startling, music sometimes, performances, the particular warmth of a large group of people who know each other well, who have worked together and argued together and helped each other through difficult seasons, sitting down to eat together and feel, for a few hours, the pleasure of collective belonging. The feast also served a function that was never stated explicitly, but was entirely understood. It was a social bond renewal, an annual ceremony of recommitment to the brotherhood, conducted not through oaths and formal procedures, but through the oldest and most reliable human mechanism available: shared food, shared drink, shared time. Anthropologists have a term for this commensality, the practice of eating together as a social glue. The medieval guilds did not have that word, but they understood the concept intuitively and deployed it systematically. You feast together with your fellow craftsmen once a year, and you are for another year bound to them in a way that is warmer and more personal than any charter can create. Now, the politics. Because the Guildhall was also in many cities and many periods the place where one of the most consequential experiments in medieval political organisation was being conducted. And it was an experiment that in certain spectacular cases went considerably further than anyone in the existing power structure had expected or intended. To understand what I mean, you need to understand what medieval city governance looked like before the guilds got involved in it. In most European cities during the early medieval period, civic government was in the hands of a relatively small group of wealthy merchant families, the patricians as historians call them, though the medieval term varied by region and language. These were the people who controlled the long-distance trade that made cities wealthy. They owned the warehouses, the ships, the import-export operations. They lent money. They collected tolls. They had connections to the nobility and increasingly to the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And they ran the city councils that made decisions about taxation, infrastructure, law enforcement, and the 1,000 other details of municipal governance. The craftsmen, the weavers, the smiths, the bakers, the tanners, the carpenters were economically essential to these cities. Their labour and their products were the foundation on which the merchants' wealth rested. But for a long period, they had essentially no voice in how their cities were governed. They paid taxes. They followed rules they had no role in setting. They watched wealthy merchant families make decisions that directly affected their working conditions, their market access, their professional rights. And then gradually the guilds gave them something they had not had before: organisation, collective resources, legal recognition, and most importantly a unified voice. The period from the 13th century through the 15th century in guild cities across Europe witnessed what historians have called the guild struggles, a series of political confrontations between organised craft guilds and the established patrician merchant class for control of city governments. The scale and intensity of these confrontations varied enormously by city and period, but in some places they were genuinely revolutionary in their character and their consequences. Let me tell you about Zurich in the year 1336 because it is one of the most dramatic and best documented examples. Zurich in the early 14th century was governed by a council dominated by two groups: the Constafel, which was essentially the city's knightly and noble class, and the merchant families who had accumulated wealth through trade. The craft guilds existed. They were recognized. But they had been systematically excluded from meaningful political representation for decades, despite the fact that the city's economy depended entirely on their labour. A knight named Rudolf Brunn saw an opportunity. He formed an alliance with the craft guilds, an unlikely political partnership between the old noble class and the organised working craftsmen, and together they moved against the established merchant council. The result was not a riot, not a spontaneous uprising. It was a carefully organised political coup conducted with the procedural precision that the guild system had taught its members to value. The existing council was dissolved. A new governing structure was established in which seats were formally allocated to 12 craft guilds and the Constafel. 12 guilds, formal representation, written into the city's constitution. The craft guilds of Zurich went from zero political representation to constitutionally guaranteed seats in the city government in a single organised action, and they held those seats. The city of Zurich was from that point forward governed in significant part by craftsmen. The story did not end there. Similar events unfolded in Basel in 1337, in Rheinfelden in 1331, in Winterthur in 1342. Across the German-speaking Swiss Confederation city after city underwent versions of this transformation, with craft guilds asserting and winning political power against established patrician elites. In the great cloth cities of Flanders, Ghent, Bruges, Ypres, the guild struggles took a different and in some periods considerably more violent form. The Flemish weavers' guilds in particular became a significant political force from the late 13th century onward, engaging in conflicts with both the French crown and the Flemish nobility that were in their scope and their consequences genuinely remarkable for organisations whose members had started the morning tending looms. The Battle of the Golden Spurs in 1302, one of the most famous military confrontations of the medieval period, grew directly out of these tensions. A Flemish militia composed largely of craftsmen and guild members defeated a French cavalry force that was by all conventional military logic vastly superior. The craftsmen who fought that battle were not professional soldiers. They were weavers and fullers and craftsmen who had organised through their guilds, who had collective discipline and collective motivation, and who demonstrated on that day that organised working people could accomplish things that the political and military establishment had not thought them capable of. I am not suggesting the Battle of the Golden Spurs was caused by guild politics alone. History is never that clean. But it cannot be understood without understanding the role that guild organisation played in creating a Flemish civic identity strong enough to put ordinary craftsmen on a battlefield and make them effective. There is a question lurking behind all of this, and I find it genuinely hard to answer with any certainty. Were the guilds in their political dimension a democratising force, or were they just replacing one form of elite control with another? The honest answer is both, depending on where and when you look. In some cities, guild political power genuinely broadened representation, brought craftsmen's economic interests into the deliberations of city government, and created more accountable and more responsive municipal institutions. The guilds that won seats on city councils did in at least some documented cases use that power to create fairer systems of taxation, to improve infrastructure that benefited working people, to negotiate better terms for their trades with outside powers. But in other cases, and the guild records are remarkably candid about this because guild members argued about it loudly, and documented those arguments, the guild political machine became its own form of oligarchy. The guild masters who dominated guild politics were not always the most skilled craftsmen. They were frequently the wealthiest, the most connected, the most politically astute. The rank-and-file journeymen whose labour had given the guild its economic power often found themselves as excluded from guild political decisions as they had been from city council decisions before the guild struggle. Power has a tendency to do that, to gather at the top regardless of how it started. What I keep coming back to when I sit with the political history of the medieval guilds is the sheer improbability of it. These were organisations built around the making of things, around craft and skill and the daily discipline of producing objects to a standard. They were not political organisations by design. They did not start with a political agenda. They started with an economic one: protect the trade, maintain quality, ensure fair prices, train the next generation. And yet, because they organised people, and because organised people develop interests beyond the immediately economic, and because the cities those people lived in were places where those interests had to be negotiated with other interests, the guilds became political, not as a plan, as a consequence, there is something in that arc that feels very contemporary to me. Organisations that start with a specific practical purpose and gradually discover that their real power is the organisational capacity they have built, that the skill of coordinating people and resources toward a shared goal translates when circumstances demand it into political effectiveness that their founders never anticipated. The guilds built guild halls to house their administrative and social functions. They ended up needing those halls for city councils and political assemblies and occasional revolutionary planning sessions as well. And the ale they drank at those feasts, well, I imagine it tasted different when the people drinking it knew they had changed something real. But the political story of the guilds, as significant as it was unfolded against a backdrop of daily economic reality, that we have not yet examined fully: the actual money, the wages, the debts, the prices, the extraordinary financial architecture that made a medieval craftsman's life simultaneously more stable and more precarious than most people today imagine. Because understanding what a craftsman actually earned, what he owed, what he spent, and what the guild's social safety net actually looked like in practice, that is where the human story becomes most intimate, most specific, most revealing of what daily life actually cost in the most literal sense of that word. And that is exactly where we're heading next. Money is one of those subjects that historians sometimes approach with a kind of reluctance, as if talking about wages and prices and debts is somehow less dignified than talking about battles and ideas and the great movements of civilizations. I have never understood that reluctance. Money is where the abstract becomes concrete. It is where political systems reveal their actual priorities, where social values get translated into daily experience, where the difference between a comfortable life and a precarious one is measured in the most honest units possible. So let us talk about money. Specifically, let us talk about what a medieval craftsman actually earned, what he actually owed, and what the guild's much celebrated system of mutual support actually looked like when someone needed it in a real pressing, urgent way. Because the gap between the theory and the practice is, as it so often is in history, one of the most interesting places to stand. First, some grounding in the reality of medieval currency, because this is an area where popular understanding tends to be genuinely confused, and the confusion matters, because without it the numbers we're about to discuss do not mean very much. Medieval Europe was not a cash economy in the way that we understand that term. For most of the early and central medieval period, coins were scarce, their value was variable, and most transactions, particularly in rural areas, were conducted through barter, through credit relationships, through the exchange of goods and services, rather than the exchange of standardized currency. The guild cities of the 13th and 14th centuries were more monetized than the countryside, significantly so. But even there, cash was not the lubricant of every transaction. Credit, informal credit, neighborhood credit, the kind that ran on reputation and personal relationship rather than on interest rates and collateral, was as important as coin in the daily economic life of most craftsmen. With that context established, let us look at some actual numbers. A skilled journeyman craftsman in 14th century England, a carpenter, a mason, a blacksmith might earn somewhere between 3 and 4 pence per day on a regular working day. Special skills or specialized work could push that higher. Over a full working year, accounting for Sundays and the roughly 40 to 50 non-working feast days we discussed earlier, that translated to annual earnings of somewhere around 12 to 16 shillings, perhaps £1 in a good year. 1 ounce of silver in the same period was roughly equivalent to a week's wages for that skilled worker. A single ounce. That gives you an immediate visceral sense of how scarce money actually was. The coins that passed through a craftsman's hands in the course of a week represented genuine labour, measured in days and specific tasks, not abstract accounting. For comparison, a loaf of bread cost approximately 1 penny. A cheap meal at a tavern, bread pottage and ale, might run to 2 or 3 pence. A pair of basic shoes could cost between 6 pence and a shilling, depending on quality. A good wool cloak, the kind that would actually keep you warm through an English winter, might cost 2 or 3 shillings. Significant expenditure, the kind of thing you budgeted for, carefully saved for deliberately, and did not replace until you absolutely had to. A master craftsman in a prosperous trade, a successful goldsmith, a well-established weaver supplying quality cloth to wealthy customers, a master mason employed on significant building projects could earn considerably more than a journeyman. But considerably more in this context means something different from what that phrase implies in a modern economy. A genuinely successful master craftsman in 14th century London might accumulate over a lifetime what a prosperous modern professional would consider a very modest net worth. The difference was not primarily in the absolute quantity of wealth, but in the security it represented. In a world without reliable banking, without deposit insurance, without any of the modern mechanisms that turn accumulated money into protected productive capital, holding wealth was itself a challenge. The apothecaries of medieval cities offer a particularly interesting case study in how financial and professional status interacted in unexpected ways. The apothecary, the medieval equivalent of a pharmacist, but with a considerably broader range of products and services, occupied a peculiar economic position. The materials he worked with were expensive spices imported from the Eastern Mediterranean, and beyond rare plant materials, mineral compounds, exotic ingredients that had travelled thousands of miles to reach a northern European city. The capital tied up in an apothecary's inventory at any given time was substantial by the standards of his neighbourhood, and his customers, because of the nature of his goods, tended to be among the more prosperous members of the community, people who could afford the luxury of specialised medical and culinary ingredients. This meant that the apothecary often found himself functioning as something that was not quite a bank, but that performed a similar social role. He held coin. He knew which neighbours could be trusted with credit and which could not. He had the financial reserves to extend loans in emergencies, and the social intelligence to know when to do so and when to decline. In a neighbourhood without formal banking, the apothecary's back room sometimes served as the community's de facto financial institution, and his appearance reflected this status. Because the apothecary's work was clean, he was not a tanner or a blacksmith. His hands were not stained or scarred by physical labour. In the usual sense, he could dress and carry himself like the prosperous professional he was. Clothing in medieval society was a legible signal of status, and the apothecary read clearly to his community as a man of substance, which reinforced his financial role, which reinforced his social standing, which reinforced his access to the guild networks that supported his business. Status money and professional organisation fed each other in the medieval guild world in ways that were not always visible, but were consistently consequential. Now let us talk about debt. Because debt was not a peripheral feature of the medieval craftsman's economic life, it was central to it in ways that complicate any simple picture of guild prosperity. The apprentice system, as we have discussed, involved an upfront payment from the apprentice's family to the master. That payment came from somewhere. For a prosperous family it might represent savings. For a more modest family it might represent a loan from a neighbour, from a wealthier relative, from the local moneylender. That debt sat in the background of the apprenticeship relationship from the beginning. The father who borrowed to place his son with a good master had to repay that loan, with whatever interest had been agreed, while simultaneously managing the household without the son's labour and without any income from the boy himself for 7 years. The journeyman who completed his apprenticeship and set out on his wanderjahr carried his own financial vulnerabilities. He was paid daily, which sounds stable until you consider what happened when work was not available. When a master's order book was thin, when a seasonal slowdown hit the trade, when the journeyman arrived in a new city and found that the local guild was not accepting outside workers, that month the daily wage disappeared, and the journeyman's expenses, food, lodging, the maintenance of his tools continued regardless. Most journeymen operated on very thin financial margins. The guild's obligation to assist travelling journeymen with a meal and a small sum in emergencies was real, as we discussed, but it was genuinely emergency support, not a regular income supplement. The difference between a journeyman who ended his wander years with modest savings and a journeyman who ended them in debt depended enormously on factors only partially within his control: the state of trade in the cities he happened to travel through, the generosity and competence of the masters who employed him, the timing of his journey relative to economic cycles he could not predict or influence. And then there was the larger economic environment, which could shift catastrophically in ways that even the most prudent and skilled craftsmen had no means of anticipating. Wool prices in England in the early 14th century, before the devastation of the plague, were tied to an international trading system of extraordinary complexity, connecting English sheep farmers through Flemish cloth merchants to Italian banking houses to markets in the eastern Mediterranean. A political decision made in Florence a war-disrupting trade routes through Burgundy. A bad harvest in the wool-producing regions of the English Midlands. Any of these could ripple through the system and arrive at the doorstep of a journeyman weaver in York as a sudden shortage of work and a collapse of the day wage he depended on. The guild system offered some protection against these macroeconomic shocks. The price fixing that we tend to view critically from a free market perspective was, from the craftsman's point of view, a mechanism of income stabilization. If the guild controlled the price of finished cloth within the city, then a downturn in demand did not immediately translate into a collapse of what each weaver could earn for his daily work. The guild absorbed some of the shock, but only some, and the shocks that were large enough, the kind that the 14th century delivered in quantities that defy modern comprehension, the guild system had no adequate defense against. Which brings us to the guild's social safety net and the question of how it actually functioned when members genuinely needed it. The theoretical provision was well established and widely documented. A guild member who fell ill and could not work was entitled to support from the guild's common fund, a treasury built from membership fees, fines, and a percentage of transactions. A member who died left a widow and children who had a claim on the guild's charitable resources, at least in the short term. Funerals were a guild responsibility. It was considered a matter of collective honour that a master craftsman not be buried in a pauper's grave, and the guild funds contributed to ensuring that this did not happen. Guild almshouses, actual physical buildings where elderly or incapacitated former members could live under guild support, existed in larger cities by the 14th century. The Weavers' Guild of Bristol, the Cordwainers' Guild of London, the Goldsmiths' Guilds of various northern European cities all maintained or contributed to charitable institutions that provided for members who could no longer support themselves through work. This was by any honest assessment genuinely remarkable for the period. The guild was in this dimension functioning as a mutual insurance organisation at a time when the concept of institutionalised social support for working people was essentially non-existent outside the church's charitable activities. The idea that professional peers had an obligation to support each other through sickness, old age, and death, that solidarity was not just a moral sentiment, but an organisational commitment with a funded mechanism behind it, was a real innovation in how human communities organised themselves. But let us be precise about the limits. The guild's charitable provision was not universal. It applied to guild members in good standing. The journeyman who had not yet achieved master status was in a more ambiguous position. He might receive assistance from the guild of the city where he happened to be working, but his claims were weaker than those of a full master. The apprentice who fell seriously ill had essentially no guild protection of his own. His situation depended entirely on the character and resources of his master, and the common fund itself was vulnerable. In periods of economic stress, precisely the periods when members most needed support, the fund's resources were most strained. A major outbreak of illness that incapacitated multiple members, simultaneously a prolonged trade downturn that reduced the fees and fines flowing into the treasury, a large funeral expense on top of other claims, these could push even a well-managed guild fund into genuine difficulty. The guild's social safety net was real. It was also imperfect, uneven, and subject to the same financial pressures that made life precarious for everyone in the medieval economy. which when you think about it is a description that applies to most social safety nets in most periods of history, including the ones we live with today. There is one more financial dimension of the guild world that I want to sit with briefly, because I think it reveals something genuinely important about how medieval craftsmen thought about money, and specifically about what money was for. The guild's official position on profit was not what a modern economic actor would recognize. The medieval guild at its philosophical foundation was committed to what historians have called the just price, the idea that there was a correct fair price for goods and services determined by the cost of materials, the labour involved, and a reasonable return sufficient to sustain the craftsman and his household. Not the maximum price the market would bear. Not the price a craftsman could command if he happened to have a monopoly in a particular moment. The just price, enough to live decently, not enough to accumulate beyond that. This sounds to modern ears either idealistic or naive, possibly both. And the guild records make clear that it was frequently honoured in the breach, rather than the observance that craftsmen pushed at price limits, found creative ways around fixed rates, accumulated wealth when they could, and argued strenuously about what just actually meant in specific cases. But the philosophical commitment was real, and it expressed something about the guild's understanding of economic life that is worth pausing over the belief that commercial activity was a means, not an end, that a craftsman's goal was not to maximize wealth extraction from the market, but to sustain a life of skilled work community participation and reasonable material comfort, that the workshop existed to produce things of value and the money it generated was in service of that purpose, not the reverse. Whether that is wisdom or limitation probably depends on who you ask. But I find it striking that an organization of ordinary working people in the 13th and 14th centuries was explicitly committed to the idea that profit without limit is not a virtue. That enough is a coherent and defensible goal, that the economy should serve people rather than the other way around. They argued about it constantly, of course. Humans always do when the stakes are real. The economic life of the medieval guild, the wages, the debts, the safety net, the philosophical commitment to the just price, all of it existed within a larger world that could at any moment change everything, not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of economic pressures that could be managed or anticipated, but suddenly, catastrophically, in a way that no guild charter, no common fund, no system of mutual support had ever been designed to withstand. In the year 1347, something arrived on ships in the port of Messina in Sicily, carried by rats and by fleas, and by the movement of trade that connected the medieval world in ways that were profitable in good times and devastatingly lethal in bad ones. It had no respect for guild membership, no interest in the just price, no awareness of masterpieces or wonder years or sworn oaths or centuries of accumulated craft knowledge. And what it did to the world that the guilds had built is one of the most extraordinary transformations in the entire sweep of human history. The plague is waiting, and so very soon are we. In the autumn of the year 1347, 12 ships docked at the port of Messina on the island of Sicily. The sailors aboard were dying. Most of them were already dead. Those still alive had strange dark swellings growing from their armpits and groins, swellings the size of eggs, the size of apples, black at the centre, weeping blood and pus. The port officials of Messina made an immediate decision. They ordered the ships out of the harbour. They refused to let the vessels dock. It was already too late. Within weeks the disease had spread inland. Within months it had reached the mainland of Italy. By the following year it had crossed the Alps, moved through France, and the Iberian Peninsula, crossed the English Channel, and begun its devastation of northern Europe. By the time the first great wave finally exhausted itself around the year 1351, Somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's total population was dead. Let me say that again, because the number is the kind that the human mind tends to slide past without truly absorbing it. 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population of Europe dead in roughly 4 years. We're talking about tens of millions of people in an era when there were no antibiotics, no understanding of how the disease spread, no public health infrastructure in any modern sense, and no precedent in living memory for anything remotely resembling what was happening. Communities watched their neighbours die in days. Families were wiped out. Priests refused to give last rites because entering the house of the sick meant probable death. Gravediggers could not work fast enough. Bodies were left in the streets. That is the scale of what the guild world ran directly into. And understanding what the Black Death did to the guild system, how it broke certain things, how it paradoxically empowered certain people, and how the world that emerged from it was different in ways that still echo today, requires sitting with that horror honestly before we move into analysis. The guild workshops of the mid-14th century were in many ways uniquely vulnerable to the plague's devastation. Think about the physical environment. Workshops were small, enclosed, densely occupied spaces. Masters, journeymen, and apprentices worked in close proximity for long hours every day. They shared tools, shared meals, shared sleeping quarters in many cases. The rats that carried the fleas that carried the bacterium moved freely through the storerooms and cellars and ground floors of urban buildings. The dense, interlocking neighbourhoods of craft districts where tanners worked near butchers, near chandlers, near bakers, all drawing from the same water sources, all producing the organic waste that attracted the rodents that spread the disease, were in epidemiological terms extraordinarily efficient vectors. Cities were hit harder than rural areas, and the craft districts of cities with their dense population and their workshop environments were among the hardest hit neighbourhoods within those cities. Guild records from the years 1348 through 1350 are in many cases simply interrupted. Entries stop mid-year. Administrative minutes that has been kept with meticulous regularity across decades suddenly fall silent for months, then resume with different handwriting new names in positions that had been held by the same people for years. The silence in those archives is one of the most eloquent historical documents I have ever encountered. It speaks more plainly than any description of the plague's impact on professional life. In Florence, which kept better records than almost any other European city of the period, owing to its sophisticated merchant banking culture, the chronicler Giovanni Villani had been writing a detailed history of the city for years. He was still writing in 1348 documenting the plague's arrival and early spread in the city. Then his chronicle stops mid-sentence in the middle of a paragraph. He died of the plague before he could finish it. His own death is the punctuation mark on his account. I do not know a starker illustration of what the Black Death actually was. Now, here is where the history becomes genuinely paradoxical. Because the Black Death, for all the horror it inflicted, and please understand I do not minimize that for a moment, did something to the surviving craftsmen that the guild system itself, for all its careful organization and its political maneuvering and its centuries of accumulated institutional power, had never been able to do. It gave them leverage. When 1/3 to 1/2 of the workforce is dead, the surviving workers become almost overnight extraordinarily valuable. The economics are brutal in their simplicity. Labour is scarce. The demand for goods and services, for bread, for cloth, for shoes, for metalwork, for the 1,000 things that people need to survive and to rebuild, does not disappear just because the people who made those things have died. If anything, the immediate post-plague demand for certain goods spiked as communities tried to repair and replace what had been lost. Fewer workers, same or higher demand. The price of labour goes up, not because anyone planned it that way, because that is what happens when supply collapses and demand does not. Surviving journeymen and skilled craftsmen across Europe found themselves in a position they had never previously occupied. They could negotiate. They could ask for higher wages and receive them, because the alternative for the master who needed the work done was either to pay or to do without. They could move between employers with a freedom that the pre-plague labour market had not offered, because every workshop in the city was short-handed and willing to hire. The power differential between master and journeyman, which had always favoured the master, so decisively shifted not completely, not permanently, but meaningfully. In England, surviving craftsmen in the years immediately following the first wave of plague were demanding and receiving wages that were 2, 3, sometimes 4 times what they had earned before. The market was simply producing that result automatically, because the market is indifferent to social hierarchy when the underlying economics are stark enough. The ruling classes of medieval Europe were not pleased. In England, in the year 1351, just 4 years after the plague's arrival, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers. The law fixed wages at pre-plague levels. It prohibited workers from leaving their employers in search of higher pay. It attempted by royal decree to reverse what the market had produced and restore the labour relations that had existed before the catastrophe. It largely failed, not because the law had no teeth, it did, and there were prosecutions and fines and genuine enforcement efforts, but because the underlying economic reality was impervious to legislation. You cannot wish labour scarcity away. You cannot pass a law that makes dead craftsmen available again. The workers who had survived the plague knew their worth in a way that no statute could entirely suppress. They evaded. They moved. They found ways around the law that the law's authors had not anticipated, because the people writing the law were not the people doing the work, and there was a gap in understanding between those two groups that legislation alone could not close. The Statute of Labourers became in retrospect one of the key grievances feeding the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the most significant popular uprising in English medieval history, in which tens of thousands of ordinary working people marched on London demanding the abolition of serfdom and the repeal of laws they considered unjust. Wat Tyler, the revolt's most visible leader, was himself a craftsman. A tiler by trade, a man who laid roof tiles, whose skills would have been in enormous demand in the post-plague reconstruction period, and who had presumably experienced first-hand the gap between the wages the law said he should earn and the wages the market said he deserved. The guild system did not produce that revolt directly, but it produced the organisational culture, the sense of collective professional identity, the understanding of collective interest versus individual interest that made such a movement possible. People who have never thought of themselves as a group do not march together. The craft guilds had been teaching craftsmen to think of themselves as a group for 2 centuries. That lesson did not disappear when the march was about something larger than guild regulations. But the plague's effects on the guild world were not only about the immediate economic leverage it gave surviving workers. Its longer-term consequences were in some ways more significant and more complicated. One of the most important was what it did to the transmission of craft knowledge. Remember everything we discussed about how craft knowledge was preserved and passed down, through apprenticeship, through the slow, direct physical transmission of embodied knowledge from master to student, through watching and doing and correcting and years of practice. That entire system depended on the people who carried the knowledge being alive. When a master craftsman died of plague, he took with him everything he knew that had not yet been fully transmitted to his apprentices and journeymen. In trades where the master's knowledge was particularly specialised, particularly esoteric, particularly difficult to reconstruct from the finished products themselves, the stained glass formulas, the metallurgical techniques, the dye chemistry, the loss could be, and sometimes was irreversible, We know this because we can trace it in the quality of certain crafts in the post-plague period. Historians and conservators who study medieval art and material culture have noted in specific techniques and specific regional traditions a decline in quality or a change in approach in the decades following the Black Death. Not everywhere, not in every craft, but in enough places to suggest that what was lost went beyond individual people and included genuine knowledge that the surviving craftsmen, through no fault of their own, simply did not possess. The plague was an epistemic catastrophe as well as a demographic one. It did not just kill people, it killed knowledge. And then there is the transformation that the post-plague guild system underwent in response to all of this, a transformation that, if you are paying attention, looks deeply and ironically self-defeating. The guilds, faced with a world in which their membership had been dramatically reduced, and in which surviving craftsmen were in high demand, responded in a way that made short-term sense and long-term trouble. They became more restrictive, more exclusive, more focused on protecting the remaining members' advantages against outsiders. The nepotism that had been creeping into the guild system before the plague, the preference for sons of existing masters, the higher fees for outside applicants, the barriers to entry that had nothing to do with skill, all of this accelerated dramatically in the post-plague decades. Guilds that had previously been reasonably open to talented craftsmen from outside the existing membership became in many cases effectively hereditary organizations. Not legally hereditary, perhaps, not formally, but practically in the sense that the fees, the connections, the family endorsements required for entry made it genuinely difficult for anyone whose father was not already a guild member. The reasoning was understandable. The guild's members had survived something catastrophic. They were now valuable. The organization existed to protect their interests. Protecting their interests meant, among other things, not diluting their market position by admitting large numbers of new competitors. The economic logic was clear, but the long-term effect was precisely the opposite of what the guild needed to remain vital. By closing its doors more tightly at precisely the moment when the world was changing fastest, the guild system began its slow transition from a dynamic institution that drove quality and innovation to a conservative institution that protected incumbents and resisted change. It did not happen overnight. The guild system remained powerful and productive for another century and more after the plague, but the seeds of its eventual decline were planted in the post-plague decades, watered by fear and understandable self-protection, and fertilized by the very success that protection initially produced. There is a moment in this story that I want to stay with because it feels important in a way that goes beyond medieval history. The Black Death did not create the tensions within the guild system. The hierarchy between masters and journeymen, the financial barriers to advancement, the exclusivity that served insiders at the expense of outsiders, all of that existed before the plague arrived. What the plague did was compress time. It accelerated everything. It took dynamics that might have played out over a century and forced them to resolve in a decade. And in doing so, it revealed something about institutions that I think is worth naming plainly. Institutions built to serve their members become eventually institutions built to serve their members' interests in preserving the institution. The transition is slow, often invisible, always justified in terms of protection and standards and quality. But the destination is always the same, an organization that was once dynamic and responsive, becoming rigid and self-protective, solving the problems of its founding moment long after that moment has passed. The guild system did not fail because it was badly designed. It failed ultimately because it succeeded too well. It created prosperity, and prosperity created the conditions for exclusivity, and exclusivity created the conditions for stagnation, and stagnation could not survive the world that was coming. That world, the one that would finally bring the guild system to its knees, was not arriving on ships in the way the plague had arrived. It was arriving more quietly, in the form of ideas of new technologies of global trade routes that made the local monopoly of the guild system not just inconvenient but structurally impossible to maintain. The decline of the guild world is not a story of villains and victims. It is something more interesting and more melancholy than that, and it is exactly where we're going next. There is a particular kind of tragedy that has no villain, not the tragedy of a great person brought low by a fatal flaw, not the tragedy of an innocent destroyed by malice, something quieter and in many ways harder to watch. The tragedy of a system that was genuinely good, genuinely valuable, genuinely worth the centuries of human effort that built it, destroyed not by its enemies, but by its own success, by the very mechanisms that had made it powerful, now operating past the point where they helped anyone, including the people they were designed to protect. That is the story of the guild's decline, and I want to be careful with it because the temptation to tell it as a simple story of progress, the modern world arriving the medieval world, stepping sensibly aside, is a temptation that does real injustice to what was actually lost. Because something was lost, something real, and naming that clearly is as important as understanding why it was inevitable. Let us start with a date and a technology, because occasionally history genuinely does pivot on a single invention, and this is one of those times. Around the year 1440 in the city of Mainz in the Rhineland, a goldsmith named Johannes Gutenberg was working on a device that he apparently described to investors as a secret enterprise with the potential for significant profit. The investors were skeptical. They had been told about secret profitable enterprises before, and those stories did not always end well. But they lent the money. By approximately 1455, Gutenberg's printing press, using movable type cast in metal, an innovation that combined several existing technologies in a way that was genuinely new, had produced the first printed Bible in European history. Around 180 copies printed with a consistency and quality that manuscript copyists working by hand for years could not match. Now why does this matter for the guild world? Because the printing press was among other things an industrial argument. An argument made in ink and paper about what manufacturing could look like when you replace skilled individual craft with mechanical reproduction. The scribe who copied manuscripts by hand was a craftsman of genuine skill, years of training, extraordinary precision knowledge of materials and technique that rivaled any other trade. The Guild of Book Copiers and Illuminators was a real professional organization with real standards and real expertise. The printing press did not make that expertise worthless overnight. The hand-copied illuminated manuscript remained a luxury object for wealthy patrons for another century and more. But the printing press changed the fundamental question from how do we train enough skilled craftsmen to meet the demand for written material to how many copies can we print per day? And no guild in the world could answer that second question with hand labour. The printing press was the first visible tremor of a shift that would over the following 3 centuries transform the guild world from the dominant organisational model for skilled production into an increasingly marginal, increasingly defensive holdout against economic forces it had no means of controlling. But the press was a symptom as much as a cause. The deeper forces were already in motion, and they had been accumulating throughout the 15th century in ways that the guild system's leadership could see, could feel, could articulate in their petitions and their complaints to city governments, and could not stop. Global trade was one of these forces. Consider what happened to European textile markets when the Portuguese established stable sea routes to India and East Asia in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Suddenly cloth that had been rare and extraordinarily expensive in European markets, fine cotton, silks, intricately woven textiles from India and China, was available in quantities and at prices that the guild textile producers of Flanders and Italy could not match. Not because European guild weavers were less skilled. In absolute terms, many of them were producing work of comparable technical quality. But the cost structure of a Flemish weaver operating within a guild system, with its regulated wages, its standards, compliance costs, its fees, and its restricted market access, its training obligations could not compete with the cost structure of goods produced by different labour arrangements on the other side of the world, moved by increasingly efficient shipping. The guilds responded the way institutions usually respond when their core market is disrupted. They petitioned. They lobbied. They asked city governments and royal authorities for protective tariffs for import restrictions, for legislation that would limit the sale of foreign textiles in their home markets. Sometimes they got it, often they did not, and when they did get it, the protection was temporary at best, eroding in the face of the commercial interests that stood to profit from trade, which were increasingly powerful and increasingly organised. Here is a detail that I find quietly devastating because it captures the gap between what the guilds were trying to protect and what the world they were operating in had become. In England, in the early 16th century, a generation of cloth merchants, the merchant adventurers as they called themselves, had developed a business model built almost entirely on exporting raw English wool and unfinished cloth to the continent for processing rather than buying finished cloth from English guild weavers and selling it in domestic and continental markets. The merchant adventurers were not craftsmen. They did not make anything. They moved things, financed things, took a margin on every transaction, and their model was generating wealth that made the best organised guild workshop look financially modest by comparison. The guild weavers petitioned the Crown repeatedly about the merchant adventurers. They argue correctly that the merchant adventurers' model was destroying English craft employment, that the wealth being generated was not flowing back into the communities that produced the raw materials and the labour, that the finished cloth work was going to foreign craftsmen when it could and should be employing English guild workers. They were right about the economic analysis. They were right about who was bearing the cost of the arrangement, and they lost anyway. Because the political power of organised international commerce by the 16th century had outgrown the political power of organised domestic craft. Then there was the matter of rural production. One of the structural vulnerabilities of the guild system was that its monopoly over craft production applied within city limits. Outside the city walls, in the villages and market towns of the surrounding countryside, those rules did not apply. And in the 15th and 16th centuries, enterprising merchants figured out with increasing sophistication exactly how to exploit that gap. The system that developed was called in various European contexts the putting out system or cottage industry. A merchant would supply raw materials, wool, flax, iron to rural households, who would process them using tools and skills that had spread informally from the guild cities into the countryside over generations and return the finished or semi-finished goods to the merchant who would sell them. The rural workers were paid per piece. They had no guild membership. They were not bound by guild price regulations, guild quality standards, or guild wage scales. They were also not protected by any of the things the guild offered its members. No sick fund, no support for widows and orphans, no training system, no professional identity, no political voice. From a pure cost perspective, rural cottage industry was cheaper to operate than a city guild workshop. And cost in a competitive market is an argument that is very difficult to answer, with appeals to tradition or quality standards, however genuinely those arguments might be felt. The guilds tried to fight this too. They pushed for city authorities to regulate goods coming in from the countryside. They argued for quality inspection requirements that would disadvantage rural production. They lobbied for legislation restricting the merchants who supplied rural workers. Some of this worked partially temporarily. None of it worked permanently, because the economic incentives pushing toward rural production were simply too strong, and the political will to protect guild monopolies against those incentives was eroding steadily. It would be easy at this point in the story to simply declare the guild system obsolete and move on, to frame the whole decline as an inevitable and perhaps even welcome transition, feudal protectionism giving way to modern market economics, the creative destruction that generates prosperity in the long run. I have a complicated relationship with that framing, because the guild system, for all the ways it became exclusionary and rigid and self-serving, and we have been honest about all of these things throughout this journey, also provided something that its replacement largely did not. It provided the craftsman with a comprehensive social context, professional identity, community, mutual protection, a system of training that actually produced mastery, not just competence, a framework within which work was meaningful in a way that went beyond the wage it generated. What replaced the guild system in the long arc from the 16th century through the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries was a labour market that was by guild standards extraordinarily free. Workers were free to work for whoever would hire them at whatever wage the market would bear, free to move between employers, free from the restrictive monopolies and closed memberships of the guild system. They were also free from the guild safety net, free from the training system that produced genuine mastery, free from the professional identity and community that the guild had built so carefully over centuries, free in the fullest and most uncomfortable sense of that word to compete in a market that did not care about their welfare, unless their welfare happened to coincide with their employer's profit. The craftsmen who sat in guild halls in the 14th century arguing about whether the just price was set correctly, whether the common fund had enough to support the widow of the tanner who had died last winter, they were participating in something imperfect, limited, often unjust in its own particular ways. But they were participating. They had agency voice and a system that acknowledged their humanity as something more than a unit of productive labour. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot, and the generations that lost it, the weavers and the spinners and the smiths whose guild systems collapsed around them in the 16th and 17th centuries, who found themselves in rural cottage industry or urban wage labour, with none of the structural protections the guild had provided. Many of them understood the loss with a clarity that comes from experiencing the difference firsthand. The English Statute of Artificers in the year 1563 is sometimes cited as a turning point, a moment when the Crown, recognising both the guild system's importance and its limitations, attempted to create a national regulatory framework for craft labour that would replace the purely local guild monopolies. The statute established a national 7-year apprenticeship requirement for certain trades, attempting to preserve the guild's quality training function while removing some of its most exclusionary features. It was an interesting idea. It also gradually became a dead letter as enforcement weakened and economic pressures overwhelmed it. By the mid-17th century, guild authority in many English trades had been effectively broken. The great guilds of London, the goldsmiths, the mercers, the drapers remained powerful and prestigious, but their economic function had shifted. They were no longer primarily professional regulatory organisations. They were social and charitable institutions, trade organisations in the modern sense, repositories of accumulated wealth and influence that bore the names of crafts their members often no longer actually practised. In France, guilds retained more legal authority for longer bolstered by the more centralised nature of the French state. But here too, by the 18th century, the philosophical winds were shifting. The encyclopedists and the physiocrats, the intellectual forebears of what would become the Enlightenment economics that influenced the French Revolution, were writing with increasing hostility about guilds as obstacles to the free market, as sources of monopoly privilege that served incumbent members at the expense of consumers and economic growth. When the French Revolution finally moved against the guilds formerly in the Le Chapelier Law of 1791, which abolished guilds along with other corporate organisations, it deemed incompatible with the principles of individual liberty. The legal argument was framed in the language of freedom. The freedom of the individual worker to practice his trade without the interference of an organisation he had not chosen. The freedom of the consumer to buy from whoever offered the best price. The freedom of the market to operate without artificial restrictions. These were not cynical arguments. They were genuinely held principles of people who believed sincerely in human liberty and economic rationality. And they destroyed something that had taken 5 centuries to build. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it honestly. We live in a world that has largely internalized the arguments that brought the guild system down. Individual liberty, free markets, the consumer's right to the lowest price, the worker's right to move freely between employers. All of these are values we hold, and on the whole I think we are right to hold them. And yet, the guild world's problems, the shortage of meaningful work, the disappearance of mastery, the loss of professional community and mutual support, the sense that what you do with your hands 5 days a week is a transaction rather than a calling, those problems have not gone away. If anything, they have intensified. The crafts worker who sat in a guild hall in the 14th century, arguing with his fellow masters about quality standards and fair wages, and who would support the sick member, and whether the apprentice had been properly taught he was living inside a system that was imperfect, exclusive, and ultimately unsustainable in the world that was coming. But he was also in a way that is harder to quantify, and therefore easier to dismiss living inside a community of work. A place where what he made mattered, where how he made it was a subject of collective concern, where his skill was recognised and his welfare was at least nominally a shared responsibility. The world that replaced his is richer by almost every measurable standard, and it is worth asking quietly in the comfortable darkness of wherever you are listening to this tonight, whether richer is always the same thing as better. There is one final chapter in this long story, the chapter about what survived, what persisted quietly and sometimes invisibly into the world we actually inhabit. What the guild craftsmen built that is still here, still shaping the way we work and live and think about the value of making things well. Because the guild world did not simply vanish. It left traces everywhere if you know where to look. And some of those traces are considerably more surprising and considerably closer to home than you might expect. That is where we end tonight. Before we go any further, I want to do something a little unusual. I want you to look around the room you're in right now. Not dramatically, not with effort, just let your eyes move across the space. The chair or the bed you are settled into. The blanket pulled up around you if there is one. The cup on the table nearby if you made something warm before pressing play tonight. The book on the shelf. The ring on your hand maybe. The wooden frame of a window, the hinge on a door. Ordinary things. The kind of things you stop noticing after the first week of owning them because the mind economizes, because attention is finite, because familiarity is the mind's way of freeing up resources for things that are actually new. But none of those things are as ordinary as they look. Every single one of them has a history. A long history connected by an unbroken thread of human practice and accumulated knowledge and professional organization to the world we have spent the last several hours inside. And when I walk you through what I mean by that, I think you're going to find yourself looking at your own life slightly differently, at least for tonight. Let us start with something you almost certainly wear or have worn at some point in your life. Gold jewellery, a ring, a necklace, a bracelet, a pair of earrings. Perhaps something inherited, something given as a gift, something you chose yourself on an occasion that mattered. The gold in that piece of jewellery is stamped in most countries with a hallmark, a small symbol indicating its purity 14 carat, 18 carat, 22 carat. You may have noticed it and not thought much about it. It is just a standard, a legal requirement, something the government presumably mandates for consumer protection. The hallmark system was invented by goldsmiths' guilds. The first statutory hallmarking requirement in English history was established by the Goldsmiths' Guild of London in the year 1300, and which the English Crown formalised into law in 1363. That law required that every piece of gold and silver work be assayed and marked before sale, tested for purity, and certified by the Guild's own assay office, which still operates today in London under the name Goldsmiths' Hall. The word hallmark literally derives from Goldsmiths' Hall. The building where the Guild tested its members' work gave its name to the practice, and the practice became so embedded in commercial culture that its name outlived the institutional context that created it. The ring on your finger, if it has a hallmark, carries a direct etymological and institutional trace back to a London guild hall of the 14th century. That is not metaphor. That is literal historical continuity. The word apprentice itself. You use it or have used it or have heard it used constantly throughout your working life. Apprentice plumbers, apprentice electricians, apprentice chefs, apprenticeship programs offered by corporations, by trade unions, by government workforce development initiatives. The word is so embedded in English professional vocabulary that it feels like it must have always been there, like it belongs to the language the way words for rain and bread and family belong to it. It entered English professional life through the guild system. The specific legal framework of the apprenticeship, the contract, the defined term of service, the master's obligation to teach, and the apprentice's obligation to serve those, are guild inventions formalised in the guild charters of the 13th and 14th centuries and eventually embedded into English statutory law through the Statute of Artificers of 1563 that we discussed earlier. That statute encoded guild apprenticeship requirements into national law precisely because the guild system that had produced them was beginning to weaken, and Parliament was trying to preserve the training function even as the institutional structure that had created it was under pressure. The word survived the statute survived the guilds, and we still use both in the 21st century for programs that are genuinely trying to do what the medieval guild did: transmit skilled knowledge from experienced practitioners to people beginning their working lives through supervised practice rather than classroom instruction alone. The form persists because it works. 700 years of evidence suggests it works. Here is one that genuinely stopped me the first time I came across it, and I suspect it will do the same to you. The Freemasons, the most famous fraternal organization in the Western world, famously secretive, famously symbolic in its rituals and its language, associated in popular imagination with everything from benign civic philanthropy to elaborate conspiracy theories depending on which corner of the internet you have most recently inhabited. The Freemasons trace their organizational heritage directly to the medieval stonemasons' guilds. Not metaphorically, not in an inspired by sense, in a specific documented terminological and structural sense. The language of Freemasonry is stonemasons' language. The degrees of membership entered apprentice, fellow craftmaster mason are the exact 3 stages of the medieval stonemason's guild career. Entered apprentice, journeyman here called fellow of the craft, and master. The tools that appear in Masonic symbolism, the square, the compass, the plumb line, the level, are stonemasons' tools, real ones. The ones that masons use to measure a line and true the stones of medieval cathedrals. The transition from operative masonry, actual stone cutting and cathedral building, to speculative masonry, the philosophical fraternity that uses Masonic symbolism for ethical and spiritual reflection, happened gradually in the 17th century as the actual craft declined, and the lodges that had organised the workers began admitting members who were not practising stonemasons, but who wanted the brotherhood and the ritual framework the lodges provided. By the time the first Grand Lodge of England was formally constituted in London in 1717, the Freemasons were already primarily a philosophical and social organisation rather than a craft guild. But the bones of the craft guild were still there. The structure, the oath, the degrees, the secrets, the brotherhood. Every Masonic lodge in the world today, and there are millions of Freemasons across dozens of countries, is in a real and traceable sense a direct descendant of the medieval stonemasons who built the cathedrals of Europe and organised themselves into guilds to protect their trade and their knowledge. I find that extraordinary. 600 years of institutional DNA threading from a stonecutter's lodge in a medieval English cathedral city through to a lodge meeting in a town somewhere near you tonight in the 21st century. And then there is France, where the compagnonnage tradition we discussed during the wandering years has never fully died. In 2010, the French compagnonnage, the living tradition of journeymen craftsmen completing their Tour de France, learning their trade under masters in cities across the country, carrying their livret compagnonique as a record of their journey, was inscribed by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization on its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Let that sink in for a moment. An organization founded by nations to protect endangered cultural practices, the same body that works to preserve languages and music and ceremonial traditions from disappearing. That organization looked at the French compagnonnage and decided it was worth the same category of protection as other irreplaceable human heritage, because it is. Because the knowledge that passes through that system, the ability to build and restore structures in traditional materials, to work wood and stone with hand tools to tolerances that modern machinery struggles to match, to understand the behavior of materials over time in ways that only come from years of sustained attention, that knowledge is genuinely rare, genuinely fragile, and genuinely irreplaceable if it is lost. Today in France there are approximately 15,000 registered compagnons, working carpenters, stonemasons, roofers, glassworkers, leather workers. Some of them are in their 20s in the middle of their tour. Some of them are masters who have spent decades accumulating and passing on the knowledge they received. The tradition is not a museum piece. It is a living professional system producing craftspeople who are sought after for restoration work on some of the most significant historic buildings in the world, including as of the reconstruction efforts following the devastating fire of 2019 Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. The cathedral that was under construction when our young apprentice was lying on his bed of straw in 1280. Being rebuilt now in part by craftspeople whose professional lineage traces directly back to the guild system of that same era. That is a circle that took 750 years to close, and it closed. Let me bring it closer to home, closer to your home specifically. If you live in a house or an apartment with wooden floors, there is a reasonable chance that the wood was laid by a carpenter, working within a trade union that inherited its structure, its apprenticeship requirements, its quality standards, its system of journeyman licensing directly from guild precedents. The labour movement of the 19th and 20th centuries, which fought for and won the workplace protections that most people in developed countries take for granted. The 8-hour day, the minimum wage, the right to organise the concept of workplace safety as a legal obligation, drew consciously on the guild tradition of organised workers asserting collective interest against individual employers. The guild system did not invent labour rights, but it invented the organisational logic that labour rights movements later deployed. The idea that workers in the same trade have interests in common, that those interests are best protected through collective organisation with enforceable standards and mutual support. that the individual worker facing an individual employer is at a structural disadvantage that can only be corrected by collective action. Samuel Gompers, who founded the American Federation of Labor in 1886 and shaped the American labor movement for decades, explicitly cited the guild tradition as a model. Not uncritically, he was aware of the guild's exclusionary practices, its nepotism, its failures, but as a precedent for the idea that skilled workers could and should organize to protect the integrity of their trade. Every labor protection you have ever benefited from, every workplace, right you have ever exercised, has somewhere in its ancestry the simple, practical Guildhall logic of craftsmen who decided 6 or 8 centuries ago that they were worth more than the market alone would give them. There is one more thing I want to share before we close, and it is the most intimate one. Somewhere in Europe, in Bruges, in York, in Tallinn, in Krakow, in any of dozens of cities that still have their medieval cores, there are buildings that guild craftsmen built with their own hands. Not the great cathedrals, though guild members built those too. The more modest buildings. The half-timbered houses of the cloth merchants. The stone guild halls. The warehouses and workshops and domestic buildings that made up the daily fabric of a medieval city. Some of them are 700 years old, some of them are older, and people live in them. Right now, tonight, as you are listening to this, people sleep in rooms where medieval craftsmen slept. They cook in buildings where medieval families ate their pottage and argued about the price of wool. They walk on floors that were laid by hands that have been trained through the same 7-year system we have spent the whole of tonight exploring. The walls of those buildings were built by people who knew things, who had been taught things carefully over years by people who had been taught by people who had been taught. A chain of transmission going back centuries in some cases to the origins of the guild system itself. And those walls are still standing, still doing the job they were built to do, still sheltering human life, still keeping the weather out, still holding the weight of the floors above and the roof above that. I find that almost unbearably moving in the best possible way. Because it means that the care those craftsmen put into their work, the care that the guild system demanded of them, enforced in them, built into them through years of difficult training and exacting standards, and the knowledge that their work would be judged, and that their judgment by their peers was the most important opinion in their world, that care persisted. It outlasted the craftsmen themselves. It outlasted the guild system that produced them. It outlasted the political structures, the economic systems, the languages in some cases. The work endured. We started tonight with a boy on a bed of straw, 12 years old in the dark in a stranger's workshop in a city that smelled of wood smoke and wet stone, and a future he could not yet see. He was frightened, probably. Excited, maybe. Certainly uncertain about what the years ahead would demand of him, and whether he would be equal to what they demanded. He got up the next morning and swept the floor, and then he did it again the next day, and the day after that, and somewhere in the middle of the 7 years that followed, the floor sweeping became tool cleaning, and the tool cleaning became watching, and the watching became attempting, and the attempting became slowly, painfully, magnificently knowing. He became someone who knew how to make something well, really well enough to stand in front of a room full of judges and let them look at his work in the clear morning light and hold his breath and wait. And whether he became a master or not, whether the money was there, whether the connections lined up, whether the guild had room for one more, he carried that knowledge in his hands for the rest of his life. No one could take it from him. It was his. That is what the guild system was really for. Not the monopolies, not the political manoeuvring, not the feast day ale. Those were the scaffolding. What it was really for was this taking a child with unformed hands and an unformed future, and building year by careful year, a person who knew something worth knowing and could do something worth doing. The boy on the straw and the walls that are still standing are the same story. A story about what happens when people take the transmission of knowledge seriously. when they decide that how we make things matters, not just what we make, when they commit imperfectly and completely humanly to the idea that excellence is worth the time it takes. I want to thank you genuinely and without formality for spending this night here with me. We covered a lot of ground together, a lot of centuries, a lot of workshops and guild halls and muddy roads and contract signings and masterpiece submissions and wandering years and plague years and political revolutions and quiet endings. And you stayed. You are still here at the end of this long, long journey. That means something to me, more than I can easily articulate in the middle of a dark night. If something in tonight's story stayed with you, a particular moment, a detail, a question it opened up, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Leave a comment, tell me what landed, tell me what you were thinking about when the lights were low and the story was moving. That kind of connection is the whole reason to do this. If you're not yet subscribed, now might be the moment. Not because of an algorithm, not because of numbers on a screen, but because if you enjoyed spending tonight here, there is more. There is always more. History is the longest story there is, and we have barely started. The next journey is already waiting. Different century, different people, different workshop, different street, different kind of courage. But the same essential thing, ordinary people doing remarkable things with their hands and their lives in a world that history forgot to look at carefully enough. Rest well tonight. The story continues.